Hello, Assalamu alaikum, and welcome to the fourth SIGA conference. This is our fourth day for the International Ummah Conference on governance and political authority in the Muslim world. This is session 5B, where we'll be exploring certain case studies of the theories that we have been exploring in the past sessions. I would like to introduce our host, Dr. Hafsa Kanjwal, who is a professor for South Asian history at Lafayette College in Pennsylvania. Her dissertation was titled Building a New Kashmir, Bakshi Ghulam Muhammad and the Politics of State Formation in a Disputed Territory, 1953 to 1963. She's the founding member of Critical Kashmiri Studies, and she has written in many different media outlets. Her her her scholarship is a critical engagement with the region and with many of the topics that we've been discussing at SIGA here over the course of our conference. Dr. Kanjwal, the floor is yours.
Hello, assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you so much, Uwais, for the kind introduction. And thank you to everyone who is listening to this panel from around the world. We have a very distinguished panel of guests. Just before we all got together, everyone was speaking in different languages from all parts of the world. So I'm very excited to be able to chair this session. So just a quick reminder that those of you who wish to listen in Arabic, so there's either the English or the Arabic option. You can go to the SIGA website to get the direct links for that. And I will be introducing each of the speakers today. And I'll give very brief introductions for those of you who want to learn a little bit more about the speakers. You can check on the conference booklet on the website. So let's just get started. We are very excited today to have 6 speakers, each talking about analyzing specific case studies about exercising political authority in different countries in the Muslim world. So to start, we have Dr. Mehmet Bulut, who is the president of Istanbul Sabahattin Zaim University. Dr. Bulut is also a professor of economics and economic history. He received his PhD from the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands in 2000 and his master's from the Posthumous Institute in 1998 in the field of economic history, and his BS and MA degrees from Dokuz Eylül University in economics. He taught at Baskin University and served as chair of the economics department. Next, we have Dr. Hamid Ersoy, who received his PhD degree in international relations from the University of Durham in England in 1994. He is currently a professor of international relations at Istanbul Sabahattin Zaim University. He had been the Secretary General of the Black Sea Broadcasting Regulatory Authorities and the Director General of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, OIC Broadcasting Regulatory Authorities Forum. And after Dr. Ersoy, we have Dr. Aiza Hussein, who's a university senior lecturer in politics and international studies at the University of Cambridge, a member of the World History Faculty and the Muhammad Noah Fellow at Pembroke College in Cambridge. Her work occupies the intersection of Islamic legal studies, comparative politics, and post-colonial law and society studies. After Dr. Hussein, we have Dr. Junaid Ahmed, who has a JD from the College of William and Mary and a PhD in Islam and decolonial thought from the University of Leeds. He's currently professor of religion and global politics at Gift University in Pakistan, as well as an advisor on the National Security Unit of the Prime Minister's Office. And then we have 2 more speakers. From Iran, we have Dr. Muhammad Ali Mirzai, who is the head of Al-Mustafa Intellectual Center in Iran and founded the Al-Hadara Center for the Development of Islamic Thought in Beirut. He's also professor of strategic studies and a specialist in Quranic research. And then finally, we have Dr. Muhammad Marandi, who is an academic political analyst and an expert on American studies and post-colonial literature. He's a graduate of the University of Tehran and Birmingham University and professor of English literature at the University of Tehran. So that is our excellent panel for today. And we'll start with Dr. Bulut, who will be speaking about Turkey, examining Turkey's domestic accomplishments and challenges. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hafsa. Bismillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah. I would like to say good evening, good morning, and good afternoon to all of you, because I think now we are in different parts of the world. In Turkey now we are in the evening, but in eastern part they are, maybe in the middle of night. So I hope we will share a good time. And secondly, I would like to thanks again for organizing this event, this fourth international conference on Islamic Ummah by SIGA, Center for Islam and Global Affairs at Istanbul Sabahattin Zaim University, and also to the supporters of this event, Hamad bin Khalifa University and the other institutions. And I also would like to thank again to all panelists and the followers of this event. So let me start my presentation. I mostly will focus on economic situation of Turkey in recent times, in recent years. As you know, when we look at the geography, Turkey is in the center in between Asia, Europe, and Africa. And Turks came to Anatolia, to this part of the world, a millennium years ago, 100 years. And first Seljuks and then the Ottomans established the strong states, and the Ottomans established a world empire. After the Industrial Revolution, the Ottoman Empire turned to modernization process. Then the successor of the Ottoman Empire became maybe the most important successor, became the Republic of Turkey. But in addition to Turkey, more than 40 countries around Turkey, after the collapse of Ottoman Empire, we have seen today most of them are a part of OIC, Islamic countries that, in this conference we are discussing their situations. During the Republican era, there was a democratic experience from the Ottoman time. In a recent period of Ottoman times, there were a parliamentary system, and from the middle of 20th century, again by the time of Adnan Menderes, Turkey again experienced its democratic system, a parliament system with different parties in the parliament, and especially after 1980s by Turgut Özal, Turkey really followed very liberal economic and social policies, and then a little bit close to domestic issues in 90s times, and by under the leadership of Erdogan, starting from 2002, a new situation appeared in Turkish democracy and economic development, and some very important achievements in social, economic, and especially in political stability in long term. It was very important, and also some new approach for becoming a regional power And as you can follow, in some issues, Turkey, started to increase her voice against some, injustice situations in the world, undemocratic, about some oppressions issues. As you know, all of you know, maybe after 2010, with 1 minute message and then, stress so many times, 5 is bigger than, this message was very important, the word is bigger than 5,
Dr.
And
Bologna, I'm so
yes.
sorry to interrupt you. Are you able to share your presentation or your slideshow in presentation mode?
Yeah, now did you see or not?
We can see it, but it's a bit small.
Oh, how? Well, okay, let me put here if I can find the right place. Where is it?
Slide Kostagisi.
Yeah, there was, if I can find it.
Slide, right there. Slide Kostagisi. Tamam.
Oh, I didn't find it here. Okay.
Kum saati var yukarıda. Rektörüm. Kum saati var yukarıda. Ha, biraz sağ, yukarıda.
Bulamadım onu işte.
Yukarı çıkın en tepede. Ha, orası işte. O, sola, orası. Tıklayın. Tamam,
Okay.
gelecek şimdi.
Now it's okay?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So, and this, we are as, the Muslims and Turkey also in that part of the world, the first center of the civilizations. Fertile Crescent is, the first center of civilizations till, the modern times, the center of the world politics, economy, and social life, intellectual activities were this center. I mentioned before the Turks came a millennium ago here. And I also would like to mention again, the Turks movement is from the east towards the west. This part Anatolia were the Diyar Rum, the lands of the Rome, when they conquered Anatolia, then the lands of the Rome became the Balkan region, European region, then they conquered that part of the world, and with conquering the Balkans, they established a world empire in this region. And Pax Ottomana was a kind of, the first time in history in this region after the collapse of Roman Empire a second time. It was a peaceful atmosphere for this, around this Fertile Crescent. Europeans, Asians, Africans, Muslims, Christians, Jews were living together in this Pax Ottomana, and they were following very different economic policies comparing to Western mercantilism in the early modern times. They were open to all differences in their markets, in their streets, in their cities. We cannot see today, a city like Istanbul or like the Ottoman times of Beytul Maqdis or like the Ottoman times of, Skopje, Bursa, it is, differences were living together. This was really very impressive and really very important experience for human being today, not just for Muslims, but also for all of the world. But first, for Muslims, I think we need to understand this heritage and this experience. they were controlling the east-west trading routes, but they were open both to the eastern and to the western merchants in this region. So I would like to focus in this presentation on the recent economic developments of Turkey. Before Erdogan, Turkey faced with a very strong economic crisis in 2001. With the effect of that crisis, after the election, just two parties entered to the parliament at that time, and the AK Party, as you know, the Justice and Development Party, became the ruling party, and from that time they established a stable political stability, and they really succeed in stabilizing the inflation down to single-digit level from 70%, increase in export and capital inflow, importance of social policies, and they put an agenda, a long-term strategy, 2023, 2053, and 2071, and increased employment, empowerment of women, development and social solidarity, regional development and strategies, increasing competition power, increasing the quality and effectiveness of public services, and growth rate they reached towards 2010 about nearby 10%. After China, Turkey really succeeded, and they also increase the subsidies for social classes, different social and economic classes in Turkey. And when we look at the macro outlook of Turkey, and GDP reached to nearby 800 billion US dollar, and GDP per capita reached to nearby 28,000 US dollar in 2019. And Turkey ranks amongst the biggest 20 economies of the world. And their success were remarkable and strong structure. They also faced with some difficulties during these times, especially after 2013. In Turkish domestic life, in domestic politics, they faced with some struggles. And as you know, in 2016, 15th of July, they faced with coup, military coup, supported from outside, with foreigners, big powers. Mostly, we have to stress by Western powers. It must be clear, unfortunately, and but you know, the unity of the society come together, and maybe in the history of democracy, the first time faced with this situation, all Turks, maybe you know, more than 80 million people come together, and they resist against this military coup, and they took a position after behind their, you know, the President Erdogan, and they supported the democracy, freedom, and, you know, human rights in this respect. It was, you know, in democratic history, I think it must be underlined times and times again. And during these times, towards the financial infrastructure, economic infrastructure. Turkish economic policies encouraged foreign investments, and they succeed also on foreign direct investment. And energy was a very critical issue. I will come later on this issue. And when we look at the GDP growth in 2008, they faced with some difficulties and affected from the financial crisis, oppressing the global economy starting from the second half of 2008 due to its solid foundations and measures timely taken, and hence recovered rapidly after 2010. And till recent years, they, just 2020 was, first 2 quarters was in difficulties, but now in recent times, again, it recovery. During this period in between 2013 and 18 especially, Turkish GDP per capita in terms of, it was reached to 64% of in European Union average. And Turkish GDP, I mentioned before, it reached to 800 billion US dollar, and GDP per capita increased, and unemployment rate in some years it was in declining, but most of time it was in expansion. And Turkish population reached to more than 80 million, and a big success in reducing interest rate in Turkey from very high, from 80s till less than 10. In recent times, it's a little bit a big discussion in Turkey, this interest rate issue. And inflation rate, again, they can succeed in recent decades. And in balance of
3 minutes.
Just 3 minutes, okay. And the budget, so some, very important story. They finished the debts to IMF, political stability, restoring economic stability, and most generous country in the world by supporting the migration from very difficulties, from Syria, Iraq, crisis they faced, and Turkey really welcomed, and big, very big support was given by the government and also by the society, and also big developments in defense industry. In addition to this, big projects in airports, 3, Istanbul Channel is coming, and highways, and 3 big bridges they succeed. And Turkey also focused on to become a hub for finance, to start to establish Istanbul as a financial center. And in addition to financial center, Islamic finance and Islamic economics also became important in recent times. And when we, look at their main goals in long term for the economy in 2023, they put an agenda to become one of the top 10 world economies in gross domestic reach to more than 2 trillion, increase the Turkish export to 500 billion, and GDP per capita just as a, nominal GDP, not as a purchasing power parity. It reached more than, this is nominal 25,000 US dollar. And in energy, there are some big aims, and they, extended their oil, gas research, investment in Mediterranean and also in Black Sea. In healthcare, Turkey made very huge investment in healthcare, and in transportation, built thousands of kilometers new railways, expand the high-speed train network, and in tourism also they made a big success. And in my conclusion, Turkey tried to, establish a balance, and maybe we tried to establish a balance in between economy, social life, and political stability, and also they tried to, increase the capacity in Islamic finance. So, as my last message, Turkey and as a Muslim countries, we have enough power, wisdom, knowledge, and experience to achieve our goals. I would like to stress something more on the economic and commercial, integration between the Islamic countries. And I had some more notes, but I think the time is not enough. Thank you so much for following me, and I hope a good success in the panel and in the conference. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Balut, for your presentation, and hopefully we will get to some of the other points that you wanted to make later on the panel. Next up, we have Dr. Hamid Ersoy, and the title of his presentation is Turkey, Assessing Turkey's Foreign Policy Over the Last Decade.
Okay, thank you, the chair, Professor Hafsa Kanjwal. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the rector, Professor Mehmet Bulut, and also SIGA and Professor Sami Al-Aryan for organizing such a timely and very significant meeting. Even COVID-19 is not an obstacle for SIGA to organize such traditional activities. I would like to congratulate the institution and university, as well as the individuals who have contributed to the success of such meetings. Well, let me dive into my subject right away, because we don't have the luxury to lose the time. As you can see, I am going to very quickly give a brief information about the historical background of the Turkish political life. Starting with the First World War, we have founded the modern republic on the ashes of the Ottoman Empire. As you all know, the events taking place right after the First World War, I'm not going to go into details. So right after the establishment of the modern republic, the politicians focused on the domestic reforms taking place because they were designed to create a totally European society and nation state instead of an Islamic empire, which was the Ottoman Empire before the First World War. And right after the well-established domestic reforms, political, economic, social, religious, we have started to witness a new period, because during this first period, we have a nation state to emerge out of the ashes of Ottoman Empire. So the new foreign policy perspective based on just one principle, that was the peace at home and peace in the world. The reason for such a policy was the fact that they wanted to concentrate on the domestic reforms. However, after one-party period, which took 30 years, we had a new world after the Second World War. And then it was the time for Turkey to concentrate on democratization period, because it was time to work with the free world as they were successful in the Second World War. So it was a timely shift from one-party political system into a multi-party political system inside Turkey. Then we come with the reforms, basically concentrated on economic policies of the country. So the Turkish lira was convertible after the last traditional military coup in 1980. So that was an attempt to integrate with the global economy. And that was really a timely shift from a centralized economy into a free market economy. And then comes the time of AK Party, which was believed that the time was ripe enough for Turkey to go back to the global stage and to become a major power, both in regional and global politics. But before analyzing them, we have to go through certain parameters that the government is going to be affected by. So there were some parameters of continuity, and without analyzing them, it will be a big defect to start analyzing the Turkish foreign policy during AK Party. So the first thing to know, to remember, not to forget, as the rector already mentioned, we have an unceasing orientation towards the West since the time of migration from Central Asian steppes, long time ago. That was true for the Selçukis, that was true for the Ottomans, and even it is true for the modern Turks. We are still Western oriented despite all the opposite factors in place. And secondly, we should remember that even the modern ruling elite of the Turkish Republic are having a heavy political inheritance from the Ottoman Empire. So the modernization and the westernization of society, and as well as the ruling elite, is even accelerated during the modern republic. So that is something to remember all our life. Another factor which had a great impact on the mindset of the Turkish decision makers is the geostrategic location of Turkey and this constant perception of insecurity in the minds of the decision makers in Turkey, with special reference to the USSR, of course. Remember, right after the Second World War, the USSR was a great threat to the territorial integrity of Turkey, both in terms of the Bosphorus, as well as some eastern provinces of Black Sea region. And one more important factor to remember was economic requirements of Turkey since its foundation, actually, because Turkey was in a great need of military modernization, transition from agricultural economy to industrial economy, and social development and urbanization were great factors to have impact on the political life in the country. And finally, the requirements of international system during the Cold War and the mindset of the Turkish ruling elite formed by the centuries-long memoirs of the Selçukis and the Ottomans. You may remember them from the soap operas of the Turkish media. You can see that heavy impact on the mindset of the rulers. And there are factors of change as well at the same time, which shape up the mindset of the Turkish politicians and decision makers in the bureaucracy in general. And the first one is change of international environment. So the change of international system from bilateral Cold War to multilateral post-Cold War system had a great impact and gave a great flexibility to the decision makers to shift from one state of affairs into another state of affairs in the different system. Another factor was change of regional dynamics, and that is to do with the transition from stable, traditional, authoritarian Arab regimes to the chaotic uncertainties and the so-called Arab Spring, which are leading to the instability of the region, including Turkey. That's why Turkey has to be very careful about the potential uncertainties and threats coming from the south. And that also had an impact on the mindset as well. So change of domestic environment, also an important factor to remember, because shift of political life from mainstream right-wing and left-wing political parties to the more conservative political party, AK Party, made a great change for the people in the street as well as the bureaucracy. So that will have an impact that we will scrutinize a few minutes later. And the change of institutional dynamics, also an important factor to recall, because formulation of foreign policy in the presidential system now is totally different than the parliamentarian system, which was designed to have a very slow and very complicated bureaucratic decision-making process in the past. That's why it was hardly possible to have any kind of radical change in the past. Now it's much easier to conclude some tangible and crucial decisions. And this is the time to see actually what kind of changes are taking place when we deal with the accomplishments. Due to time limit, I'm not going into detail, but let me just remind one by one with a brief explanation about them. Change of self-perception during AK Party, as you all know, is one of the most significant change and accomplishment to take place. Because up until then, up until AK Party came to power in 2002, the self-perception was different, was totally different than the self-perception of today's decision makers residing in the Kulliya. Then the decision makers as well as politicians were perceiving themselves as the representatives of a country which has limited power, which has no relevance to the region, which is Western oriented, but to the extent that they are in a position to comply with the instructions either coming from Washington or Brussels. But now things changed drastically. Now the self-perception is totally different in a way that it is more self-confident, it is more deeply rooted into the geostrategical location of the country, and it has a lot to do with the historical background of this country, including Ottoman Empire and the Selçukis. So when the self-perception has changed, the political vision and the political perception of the government has also changed accordingly. The second important accomplishment which took place was again to do with the perception, and it is to do with the perception that the country ruling elite started to perceive themselves as a representative of a wise country. So if you are in a position of a wise country, then you change your mind as well. You change your perception as well. You change your policies accordingly. And that's why they started to mediate, to have a role of mediation between smaller countries around in the neighborhood and even beyond, when they either requested to do so or they were open to have a kind of mediation led by Turkey. And such initiatives, such new roles, opened and paved the way for the new actor to take even more initiatives. So the new actor, Turkey, became an order-building country, in the international arena, not only in its own region, but also at the global level. Now it has more than 10 countries where it has military bases or military equipments, military advisors, and so on, to initiate the regional or national countries in Africa, even in Europe, in the Balkans, and in Asia. The third most important factor, accomplishment, I would like to recall, is the use of soft power. In the past, before AK Party, in Turkey, it was very rare to observe that the country is in search of use of soft power. But now, as you can see on the slide, all such institutions were created together with AK Party. None of them existed in the past. TICA is dealing with lots of projects worldwide, from Africa to Asia, from Europe to Pacific. We have even Latin America. We have TICA centers where they are or coordinating certain projects to contribute to the development of the countries. YTB, AFAD, Yunus Emre Institute, they are all means and instruments of soft power to be actively operational together with or in parallel with the Turkish Foreign Ministry. An effective use of preemptive diplomacy was something totally new to Turkey, because before AK Party, there wasn't such a thing at all. There was not such an initiative, neither initiative nor even the intention to have such a diplomacy. It was as if none of our business. We were not interested in it at all. But now, in so many regional developments, Turkey takes very active initiative to have a preemptive conclusions with its shuttle diplomacy in the region. Emergence of the public diplomacy was, again, something totally new to the country. Before AK Party, there wasn't such a thing, or it was very limited. But now there are so many institutions, together with the Minister of Foreign Affairs, are campaigning and coordinating very successful initiatives worldwide whenever it is needed on certain issues.
Hello, Dr. Hamid.
I think some disconnection.
Some disconnection, okay.
Okay.
Okay, well, we'll wait for maybe 10 seconds, not. No, I can't. If not, we'll go to the next speaker. Okay, so next speaker is Dr. Hussein, and the title of the presentation is Courts, Networks, and Public Order in a Muslim State. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Al-Arian and the SIGA staff. Thank you to the university for organizing such a rich and important conference at a difficult time. I'm sorry we didn't get to hear the rest of that presentation. It would have been a good segue into this, but hopefully we'll be able to continue the conversation when he comes back. So this paper is on Malaysia, and it zooms in much more closely to a particular place and time, contemporary Malaysia, and the ways in which Malaysia as a Muslim majority state deals with questions of Islam, religious inclusion, and questions of majority and minority religion through domestic courts. But the way that I have chosen to think about this has been to think about the domestic courts as embedded in international networks as well as historical ones. And so to read one case as a way of thinking about how sovereign national courts in Muslim majority countries are still embedded in both colonial and international networks, which then not just influence their reasoning, but create different kinds of categories of religion, majority and minority communities, and deal with questions of citizenship in the contemporary period. So this paper on Malaysia sets out to discuss ways in which internal and domestic decision-making by courts is affected by present and historical networks between states and jurisdictions. It begins with a baseline question, which might extend to all the cases being discussed in the panel today and beyond, which is how Muslim majority states determine the scope, content, and authority of Islam as a domestic issue. But it seeks to answer that question through thinking about how the fundamental sovereign institutions of the state, domestic national courts dealing with constitutional matters, draw upon internal as well as external sources of reasoning, jurisprudence, and case law. It seeks to understand these institutions and the actors working within them as embedded in networks. And it illustrates that, at least in the cases I discussed today, these networks are not necessarily just comprised of other Muslim majority states, which is what we'd expect if we thought about domestic courts as primarily normative institutions. I look at citational practices of the courts, the ways in which courts reason, the case law they consult, and the other cases they see as being relevant, to show that they're institutions embedded in past and present colonial networks. And I look at these citational practices which respond to contemporary challenges, such as the constitutional definition of religion, toleration, citizenship, and harmony, have in recent past cases been concerned with the consolidation and maintenance of public order. So the case for today is Malaysia. Religious freedom is guaranteed in the Malaysian constitution, and this guarantee has in the last 50 years or so presented an important constitutional model for Muslim and non-Muslim states working to balance majority identity with minority citizenship rights. And in recent years, the courts have linked religious freedom, which is a term with a fair amount of jurisprudence and analysis behind it, to religious harmony, a concept which is neither obvious nor well defined. The courts have reasoned this link by relying upon colonial networks and precedents, and in so doing, they have linked religious harmony to ideas about public order. Against the backdrop of contemporary global politics, public order has exerted a particular influence on the concept of religious harmony, with implications for states, communities, and individuals. Beyond the Malaysian case, this paper builds upon recent efforts in the scholarship on empire and law as key factors in the study of international history and international relations, making visible a series of interlinked domestic, transnational, and global spaces in which agents, institutions, and ideas travel. And these are conditioned by both imperial and international logics. But rather than taking international or imperial institutions as the center of this process, as Professor Ersoy has already mentioned, right? Instead of taking as the center Western imperial or Western global hegemonic powers, the paper does so from the vantage point of Muslim majority states such as Malaysia and Pakistan. So a bit of historical background. India, Pakistan, Malaysia, and Singapore, amongst other post-British colonies, share a legal legacy, which is the Indian Penal Code of 1860, still to a large degree the letter of the law in all 4 states. The Indian Penal Code set aside as a particular category of offenses relating to religion, Chapter 15, whose common character is injury against the religion or religious feeling of a class. During the period of British rule in India, Chapter 15 cases tended to involve one religious observance clashing with another, either within a class, within a religious group, or between classes, between Muslims, between Hindus. The politics of colonial governance gave new relevance to the sense of religion bestowing a group identity above all others. And by the beginning of the 20th century, community interest governed by religious identity had become a significant driver of colonial and proto-nationalist politics in British India, as well as in the Straits Colonies and Malaya. In South and Southeast Asia, the British saw their presence backed by strong law as the bulwark against community and ethnic strife. And in Southeast Asia in particular, British security measures toward the end of the colonial period provided criminal law with a new internal security counterpart. In 1948 Malaya, the Sedition Act and the Emergency Powers Act, which would become, in Malaysia and Singapore, the Internal Security Act. The end of formal colonialism brought with it an even more explicit engagement of the connection between religion and violence and the role of the law of the state in upholding public order. And since the independence period, these offenses have generally been elaborated through law rather than truncated. Constitutional drafting processes provided post-British colonial states with a wealth of potential avenues to follow, alongside institutional, legal, and political resources that weighted the balance of outcomes more heavily in some directions than others. And in addition, British lawyers and jurists sent to advise constitutional committees in Ceylon, Sri Lanka, India, Pakistan, and Malaya were instructed by the imperial government to steer clear of bills of rights. In addition to templates provided by colonial officials, however, constitutional drafters in each of these states would borrow from each other, advise each other, and provide each other with cautionary tales, none more acutely than in the area of balancing communal rights with state authority, again, utilizing the language of public order. So by the time we get to independent constitutional Malaya, Article 3, Section 1 of the Federal Constitution of Malaysia states, Islam is the religion of the Federation, but other religions may be practiced in peace and harmony in any part of the Federation. Since the founding of the Federation, this statement has been under scrutiny and has received a great deal of commentary in the courts, both by those who assert the Islamic character of the Malaysian state and by those who argue that Malaysian law provides for religious freedom. And the courts themselves have interpreted this provision in a range of ways, at times stressing the religion of the Federation component, while at others insisting other religions may be practiced in peace and harmony. Scholars of law, politics, and religion in Malaysia have considered this delicate balance between Islam as the religion of the state and the religious freedom of non-Muslims. However, the case that I'm about to discuss represents something of a turning point in the discourse of the courts, marking a rather surprising reinterpretation by the Malaysian courts of this idea of peace and harmony, not as a guarantee of freedom of worship, but as its limiting condition. So the case begins with a 2009 case brought by the Roman Catholic Archbishop of Kuala Lumpur against the government. In 2008, the Herald, the newspaper of the Catholic Church in Malaysia, was issued a license to operate, which stipulated the condition that they could not publish in the Malay language, could only be sold in churches, and had to be marked consumption only for members of the Christian religion. When the newspaper appealed the decision, the use of Malay was granted and the circulation conditions were upheld, but a new condition was added. I quote, "The use of the word Allah is prohibited until the court has made a decision on the issue." The Archbishop of Kuala Lumpur filed for judicial review by the Court of Malaya, arguing that the licensing rule was beyond the scope of the law, that it violated constitutional provisions for freedom of religion, speech, expression, and the right of religious groups to manage their own affairs. And he sought a ruling from the courts, I quote, that the word Allah is not exclusive to the religion of Islam. In defense of the license restriction and in response to this appeal, the Minister for Home Affairs argued, I quote, "It is intended to ensure the prevention of religious confusion that could threaten public safety and peace and raise religious sensitivities in this state." The minister argued that the Federation and the citizens of Malaysia understood Allah to mean, I quote again, "the one God for the followers of the religion of Islam as revealed in Al-Quran, Surah Al-Ikhlas, and that religions other than Islam were prohibited from using terms specific to the religion of Islam." And this has been the case since the 1980s. Malaysian law has prohibited the use and possession of Bibles in the Malay language to all except Christians in churches. Words deemed to be exclusive to Islam were prohibited from being used in printed materials by other religious groups except to describe Islam. And these laws were justified through the logic of internal security and by reference to a post-colonial historical narrative in which violence is incited by uncontrolled expression of ethnic and religious identity. So the 2009 ruling by the High Court addressed these issues, but the judgment also noted that the word Allah was in use by Muslims and Christians in Muslim countries in the Middle East without confusion, and that the court needed to treat, I quote, "avoidance of confusion as a ground very cautiously." The Constitution of Malaya and Malaysia, drafted in consultation with judges, including at the time from the newly independent India and Pakistan, also guarantees freedom of religion in Article 11. And it prohibits non-Muslim proselytization of Muslims. And so the court ruled in 2009 that prohibiting the use of Allah in this way did in fact violate the rights of non-Muslim Malaysians to religious freedom. However, in 2013, the Court of Appeal overturned the ruling in favor of the Minister for Home Affairs, and the court weighed the restriction on freedom of worship against what it called the potential disruption of the even tempo of the community. The judge argued, I quote, "It is also my judgment that the most possible and probable threat to Islam in the context of this country is the propagation of other religions to the followers of Islam," end quote. And in making these arguments, the court referred to a wider body of judicial precedent in India and in the United Kingdom. It referred to Supreme Court decisions made in India that make the distinction between law and order and public order, making the argument that restrictions on fundamental constitutional rights had to be held to a higher standard than the mere violation of law. And it quoted other court cases more recently, including from the Supreme Court of India, Collector and District Magistrate versus Sultan, 2008, which include the question of the suspension of habeas corpus in the face of armed violence against the state. The judgment then goes on to cite cases from the British courts. Hosenball from 1977, the Secretary of State for the Home Department, and McQuillan, 1995, and X and Y versus the Secretary of State for the Home Department, 2004. And all of these cases by 2013 were unfolding against the backdrop of high anxiety in the press and in popular politics about the place of Islam in the Malaysian state and in public life, in which the intertwined definitions of Malay ethnic and Muslim religious identity were called into question. Against this backdrop, when judicial decision-making is both highly politicized and highly scrutinized, making it all but impossible for judges to comment on present politics and events in their own jurisdictions, citation provides important opportunities to validate decisions and makes analogizing and comparing between a local situation and a global issue possible. So in 2013, these citational choices placed what I'll call the Ummah case in the ambit of common law debates about suspensions of due process and equal rights in the context of attacks against the security of the state. In the UK cases in particular, the central figures in the cases were foreign spies, political antagonists, armed militants, and united a genealogy of public order reasoning in British common law with post 9/11 discourses on national security, for which the United States would then provide a new and expansive vocabulary. From these citations to the UK cases, the Malaysian judge would make the argument that it is not the role of the court to probe for strong evidential proof of national security. The Malaysian court, following UK and US precedents, therefore, considered interests of national security to be sufficient to limit judicial function. And as in the UK and perhaps also the US, the courts have not consistently been in competition with the executive for jurisdiction. And so in Malaysia, the courts have deferred to the executive in matters perceived to fall under the ambit of national security. The Ummah case represents a development in Malaysian law, in which the religious freedom of non-Muslim minorities, guaranteed by the federal constitution, is explicitly weighed against considerations of public order and national security. And the 2015 ruling translated a constitutional guarantee of religious freedom, peace and harmony, into a condition, public order, meaning that religious freedom can only be exercised if peace and harmony are not threatened. So 3 elements, this is my conclusion, 3 elements about the Ummah case make visible the impact of the colonial past on the Malaysian present and the neo-colonial global order on the Malaysian present. The first is the institutional legacy of British colonial law, in which a claim for free speech and religious freedom was located within the logic of public order, in which the language of peace and harmony could be understood as a limiting condition of minority rights. The second is an orientation towards fact-finding in the case of religious practice that depends strongly on reference to sacred texts rather than on practice. And a tradition constructed in the British colonial system, applied to native religions in the colonial period, that is now liberally utilized in the post-colonial system to adjudicate the religious practice of religious minorities. And the third is ongoing networks of post-colonial citation, and the legal training and methodologies in common that allowed a connection between this case in Malaysia with the Indian and British cases, and that facilitate an ongoing and evolving common law lexicon that connects home affairs, internal security, public order, and national security. And I look forward to the conversation that continues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hussain. So I'm going to ask Dr. Hamid if you could please take 3 minutes or so to provide some concluding remarks, since your presentation was cut short.
Sorry for the disruption. I mean, the reasons of which are not known by myself, actually. But anyway, let's save the remaining time at least. So as I was talking about the accomplishments, I was about in halfway through. So we had the self-perception, we have the new role to play in the international affairs, and we started to use the preemptive diplomacy, the soft power, and we try to make best use of the public diplomacy and the humanitarian diplomacy, where I was disrupted somehow. So as I said, the new Turkey, the new decision makers, the new ruling elite of AK Party were well aware of their political power and economic powers, and they were making the best use of them for the sake of national interest in the international arena. And it started to have a multi-dimensional foreign policy, and it started to have this perception of historical responsibility, which was already shared by the rector, that we have the strong connections with almost all the Islamic countries which are the members of the OIC currently.
Dr.
And that's why,
you need to be on the English channel, please.
am I not in the English channel?
You are in the off channel.
Oh my God. I don't know. I don't see the place to play. I don't see the button to.
Altta hocam şey yazıyor orada. Dünya haritası gibi bir şey vardı ya. En altta. Yok, altında İngiliz.
Şey dağılmış durumda. I don't see it, and I don't think I can see it actually.
It's right next to the record.
No, the appearance is totally different now. At the beginning, it was I had a different windows, but now it's all scattered all over the screen. No, I don't think I can see it actually. Let me finish in this way, if you don't mind, because
You can stop sharing screen and then you will get the option, I guess.
No, I don't see. I should disconnect and come back again.
Dr. Hamid, are you able to stop sharing your screen?
I can stop sharing, or it is. So share English and mute original voice.
Yes.
Okay, and now I share again. This is something I normally hate to see, but it happened to myself in person, unfortunately. Sorry for that. And as I said, we were well aware of the historical responsibility of modern Turkey, despite being a nation state, a secular state, with the new perception of the modern republic. During the AK Party governments, we started to have this historical responsibility towards the neighboring countries and the remaining territories in North Africa, in the Middle East, in the Balkans, and in the Caucasia, as we have seen recently in the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And finally, as it was mentioned earlier, we had such as civilizational geopolitics, and that's to do with the alliance of civilization initiated by the United Nations earlier. So coming to the challenges, I will try to wrap up as early as possible. We have three major challenges we are facing recently, one of which is the deteriorating Turkish-EU relations, which has a great impact on the political life in Turkey and its economy. And also the deteriorating Turkish-American relations recently have great impact on Turkish economy. They are playing with the Turkish currency, as you are all well aware of. And the last channel, externally, we are having this Arab Spring, which is a destabilizing factor for the region, as well as for Turkey. As you know, we have around 4 million refugees or migrants in Turkey from Syria, Iraq, and even Afghans and Pakistanis through Iran. So they are settled somehow in the country, or they are moving through the country into the European countries. So these are three major external challenges that Turkey is facing and is trying to do its best to somehow avoid its negative impacts on the economy and politics of the country. Internally, we have another group of challenges, one of which is FETÖ, as you all know. It's a so-called religious terrorist organization, which was manipulated by external powers, as we are all well aware of it, through so many documentaries and other news coverages from around the world. And PKK is another so-called ethnic terrorist organization, which was also played with the regional neighboring countries as well as other international actors, including the major powers. And finally, we have some economic challenges, and that is also to do with a broader impact on Turkish foreign policy, because the financial restrictions, because of the economic challenges, it has difficulties to complete or fulfill its international mission through the institutions like Ministry of Foreign Affairs, TICA, AFAD, and many other institutions. And finally, my conclusion is as follows. Turkey has proven recently that it could simultaneously deal with several crises at the same time, as it is the case in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Azerbaijan, and East Mediterranean Sea. All crises are on the agenda, and they are dealing with all of them simultaneously. The second conclusion that I have is the fact that the recent events prove that external commitments and achievements have remarkable positive impact on domestic politics. And another conclusion is that Turkey has proved that it can tackle with the external crises despite internal political tension and economic hardships, which are actually believed to be created artificially by external powers, as it is the case with the Turkish currency. And also another conclusion, despite the serious challenges laying ahead, both regional and global environments seem to contribute to the national objectives of Turkey in the long run, as it can be exemplified on many occasions, but it's not the time here. And finally, recent developments prove that Turkey's vision and mission in the field of foreign policy has shifted from peace at home and peace in the world to a more proactive foreign policy, as it has been observed in recent decades. I would like to thank you all for being patient with me, and despite this disruption, for giving me the opportunity to express myself in full. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Soy. And next we have Dr. Junaid Ahmed, who will be speaking about Pakistan and Islam, what happened and why.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. It's wonderful, once again, to be with SIGA, which is like a second home. All my sisters and brothers there. It's wonderful to be amongst a very distinguished panel, and on top of it, with someone who is chairing this session, a very dear friend, a dear colleague, and a very brilliant scholar, Dr. Hafsa Kandral. So I feel a little intimidated by all of these individuals, and so far the excellent presentations that I've heard. And I also feel that this panel, I believe, has quite a number of panelists, and so I do have a tendency. My dear little younger sister there, Saima, did say that she would also point to me when I'm going over my time, and I'm sure many others will also point that out to me. So it's a bit difficult to speak about the topic that I'm going to be speaking about, that is Pakistan and the relationship between Pakistan governance and Islam, and a kind of a broad overview. So what I intend to do in this brief presentation is to give an interpretive overview of what I think have been the competing ideologies of certain interpretations of Islam that have been contesting for state power, and I think that locating that within a broader context of the foundation of Pakistan, and to where it is today. And so I will try to do that in the time allocated to me without going on tangents here and there, as I am prone to sometimes. So let me begin by saying that unrelated to really kind of the question. Actually, not so much unrelated. In fact, I would argue, we have to think about when the formation of Pakistan took place. I mean, I don't want to insult the intelligence of the people here, but the partitioning of British India and of Hindu majority India, Muslim majority Pakistan, and the whole narrative that has been told to us about that partition up until the present. Of course, now things have changed so dramatically in India that perhaps we may hear this less and less so, thankfully. But for the longest time, the narrative was that, look, the British Raj left. It's kind of almost in a Bollywood movie style scenario. It left two children in the subcontinent. One was this very progressive, secular, democratic India, the good child, and then there was this other country, Pakistan, which the less said, the better about it. And we hear the rhetoric has been there for particularly since the 90s, and of course post 9/11, failed state, and so on and so forth. I mean, all sorts of things have been said about Pakistan, and of course, one points to the idea that not only was it a failed state from the beginning, but you can point to, well, there was a second failure. The country split apart in 1971. East Pakistan, which there were two parts of Pakistan, West Pakistan and East Pakistan, divided by about 1,000 miles of unfriendly Indian territory. East Pakistan at that point, then in a civil war, became the independent nation of Bangladesh. So all of these factors are kind of pointed to essentially categorize Pakistan as this kind of very a country of a history of kind of problems, manifold, and just basically barely surviving. Okay, so but what I want to do is now just focus on a little bit how Islam has played a role in the way that various regimes in Pakistan, from the inception to the present time, how you have had, and I will focus primarily on two, and I'll not really focus too much on an area on which I've spoken a lot about and written more about, and that is kind of the 1980s and what the Islamic militancy that emerged from that time up until the present and so on. But what I wanted to speak about was about Islamic modernism, okay, on the one hand, and the role of the ulama in Pakistan during this time, and the way that they contested for state, not necessarily for state power. We're not talking about a theocracy or that type of thing here, but in terms of obtaining their wishes in terms of state law and governance and so on and so forth. So I think it's important because we often think of Pakistan, particularly over the past couple of decades, not even of the ulama, I mean, but of kind of Islamist militants and so on, that has kind of dominated the terrain of thinking about the Islamic narrative, the Muslim narrative in Pakistan. Whereas I think that there is a much richer narrative that totally gets eclipsed when we do that. And I think that it's important to start from that initial period beginning from 1947, and of course Muhammad Ali Jinnah, father of Pakistan. People say, I mean, there's always debate about his statements, but of course, one of his most powerful statements was that Islam came into this world, just paraphrasing, to bring democracy, to bring justice, pluralism, and equality And that was what the Prophet ﷺ did, and that is what we have to do. And so, unfortunately, Jinnah died just a year later after partition in 48, and the first Prime Minister, Liaquat Ali Khan, and who actually promulgated the first of what's called the Objectives Resolution. It was in some ways very much part of a kind of a modernist trajectory that was obviously infusing the entire world at that time. And so, but in Pakistan, the distinction that needs to be made is that we have never dealt with the type of kind of a hard secular repressive authoritarianism that, say, in other parts of the Muslim world, in the Arab world, for example. So there was never any question about kind of Islam in some ways being the master signifier for the masses. There was never any contestation. It was okay. What type of Islam actually do we want to actually have the masses kind of be inclined towards? And so, it's the initial period of Pakistan, say up until the 1970s, was what we can call Islamic modernism, and both the regimes themselves consumed by a developmental paradigm, very much influenced by in political science thinking and all of this and modernization theory. So that type of modernism, but also then cultivating certain, some from the ulema themselves. So for example, obviously the most prominent individual in this, after just historically speaking, the short period of kind of civilian rule, Liaquat Ali Khan as prime minister, the first constitution there in 1953, again, to the dismay of the ulama, who really had they wanted no role in there. Modernists were happy. Basically, a very vague reference to kind of, whatever laws that we are going to implement, they should not be in contravention of both the Sunnah and the Quran and so on. So that's fine. And the modernists were fine. And because the modernists always had a conception, and I'm talking about Muslim modernists. We are not talking, I will get to the kind of very Islamophobic secular liberals of the present period, but at this period, they were very kind of genuine Muslim modernists who believed in kind of, this is the way that kind of the direction that Islam can take us to modernity, progress, and so on and so forth. And so they always saw that as not problematic because for them it was kind of an ethical commitment to the public good. And so they never really had a problem with that. And the ulama, of course, had a problem because they really did want to see some role for them in terms of deciding whether this, whatever Islamic law that would be implemented or what discussions happening would be that they would be consulted about those affairs. The bureaucracy, the military, did not seem to think that these politicians were doing that great of a job. In 1958, we get to the first military rule under Ayub Khan, and that in some ways is the peak of Islamic modernism in Pakistan. Ayub Khan, again, consumed entirely, and this is also part of. We don't have time to get into this, although folks there know that this is the stuff that I talk about in terms of the geopolitics surrounding Pakistan. But of course, Pakistan has very much become part of the Western camp during the Cold War, and of course is deeply influenced by all of these social scientists, and the economists, etc., coming, telling it how to modernize and so on. And Ayub Khan kind of really jumps on this bandwagon, and corresponding to that, he supports a notion of Islamic modernism. And the preeminent individual that represented that at that time was Fazlur Rahman, the great Muslim intellectual Fazlur Rahman, who was appointed the director of the Islamic Research Institute at that time. And he had done his DPhil at Oxford. He taught at McGill for a little while and then came back. And he was there for a while, but the problem then slowly became his very cozy relationship with this military dictatorship, and this is a problem that we will recurringly see also when we fast forward to the Musharraf and the present period. So the cozy relationship between Fazl Rahman, again, very well respected Muslim scholar, unquestionably. His contributions, agree or disagree. But so, his relationship and is often Islamic justifications for the military rulers, say, curtailment of civil liberties, of freedom of press, and so on and so forth. That, in fact, probably the ulama, of course, were, in arms at this point. The ulama, the Jamaat Islami, other Muslim political parties, etc., they were up in arms against some of these things. And in fact, some of that Islamic modernism of Fazl Rahman, of Ayub, in fact, aided in the popularity of these groups because of the nature of the authoritarianism that this Islamic modernism was so closely linked to. And so that project failed quickly, not necessarily because of these injunctions, but of course, some people may know that Fazl Rahman wrote this book on, very famous book, is called Islam. And of course, that was the chance for the ulama and the Islamists to go after Fazl Rahman, because they had profound disagreements on particularly the chapter on the Quran and the role of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and so on and so forth. So after that, Fazl Rahman is gone. Ayub Khan is gone in 69 after a mass revolt. And Yahya Khan takes over, and we have the first national elections in the history of Pakistan that takes place in 1970, in which the overwhelming majority of seats in parliament are won by the Awami League in East Pakistan, that was later to form Bangladesh. Of course, the West Pakistani elites could not tolerate that, and therefore we had a civil war. And that is when East Pakistan split away, and of course Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, who had less seats, was complicit in that. People often forget that. We think of the Bhutto years as kind of this interregnum within the kind of dominant stream of. But as we will see, some of the things that we would like to all place, many of the kind of more liberal and secular folks would like to place all this blame of kind of quote unquote Islamic fundamentalism going amok on the Ziaul Haq years. Under Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, we begin to see a series of steps that really does beyond the 1973 constitution that actually he puts into place, which actually does please to a significant extent the ulama and other forces, Islamist forces, and by that time Islamic modernism is in retreat, is in retreat. But what we also see is that Bhutto wants to kind of assert. Now, again, this could be kind of political opportunism, whatever it may be, but these are the facts. He asserts kind of this Islamic Brotherhood. He hosts this huge Islamic summit in Lahore, where people would be aware of, where King Faisal, Muammar Gaddafi, and Yasser Arafat and others come to. He does that. He introduces the Ministry of Religious Affairs during that year. And same year, he declares the heterodox group, the Ahmadiyya, as non-Muslims. So all of these things, he bans alcohol. These things are taking place under a Zulfikar Ali Bhutto regime that claims to come on the platform of a very kind of Islamic socialist. Now, it's very interesting. I mean, the Islamic adjective placed before socialist, because this was a mass popular uprising. But it was interesting that you could not escape the term Islam and Islamic in it, and that goes back to what I was saying earlier in some ways, that Pakistan, in some ways, did not confront that problem that many other nations did. That Islam was that kind of master signifier that united kind of peoples from different regions, ethno-linguistic, etc., that had otherwise nothing much else in common, but that Islam did unite. Of course, this is not just a question of within Pakistan, but it's beyond Pakistan as well. So, but we realized that he had to insert the term Islamic socialism. But of course, for the ulama and for other Muslim political parties, I mean, socialism was kufr, and therefore. No, that was not permissible. So, despite Bhutto's kind of making these enormous concessions, more than any other regime in the history of Pakistan, to in terms of what the religious political parties and the ulama desired, still they started a movement against him, the Nizam-e-Mustafa, the system of the Prophet, against him. And it was not, the movement was successful. It was able to mobilize a lot of political, obviously the political parties, the ulama, as well as center-right forces.
And sorry to interrupt. You have 3 minutes.
I have 3 minutes. Oh gosh. Okay, I'll get to Musharraf then right away. So the thing is, and I said that good thing. I'll skip the 1980s entirely. But the thing is that it was also a lot of Bhutto's own mistakes. The 1980s, I think many people know about kind of the Islamization from above that Zia tried to implement in the country, right? I mean, and there's no question that was a blow to what we can call Islamic modernism or so on and so forth. However, I think that there's a temptation to argue that, but Islamic modernism had already seen its kind of heyday in the previous period, and it was already in the retreat during the Bhutto years. And in addition to that, still a very secular, a colonial secular bureaucracy existed, as well as within the military itself. And so there's a tendency to overplay the Zia period in terms of its repression of that. Now, let me just fast forward. The 90s were just a very uninteresting period in terms of just plunder and looting the nation by so-called civilian Democrats. So I can skip that and move on to the post 9/11 Musharraf period, in which Musharraf himself, again, because of the pressure placed on Musharraf post 9/11, General Pervez Musharraf, to make a U-turn on Pakistan's policy of, say, whether in Kashmir, whether in Afghanistan, support for the Taliban regime in Afghanistan, to make that U-turn. So he was under threat at times from a lot of assassination attempts. He tried to recharge this Islamic modernism through a particular individual named, people may know, Javed Ahmed Ghamdi Sahib. Javed Ahmed Ghamdi. And he was on TV all the time, etc. And he spoke to middle classes, did not have much of a social base. And that actually didn't work really well. He ended up in exile in Malaysia, and now he's sitting in the United States. And I think that and I'll conclude with this, that the entire kind of history of this has been, and I promise you, Hamza, I'm finishing up. The entire history of this has been the contestation of these kind of elite actors to try have a say in the influence of the state versus kind of vast kind of the social movements from below, trying to kind of give teeth to what the kind of emancipatory vision of Pakistan was going to be from the beginning, that Iqbal had, that Iqbal articulated, that Jinnah articulated as well. And so that has been lacking from the beginning in terms of the state and governance structures that we have seen up until Imran Khan. Of course, that's a bias, but the point is that what people have now said, and I'll conclude on this, is that look, the time has come to reimagine, rethink and reimagine Pakistan. We have not sufficiently reimagined Pakistan. And my answer to that is that actually, no, I think that we have not sufficiently decolonized. I think that is the real issue for Pakistan today, that decolonization did not end in 1947, and that the larger, expansive Iqbalian notion of what a Muslim homeland, what a nation, again, remember, nation, this Pakistan nation is something new. It has no lineage to kind of, neither to the Mughal Empire or to the Delhi Sultanate. It cannot claim that. But that newness offers it a lot of possibilities as well. And so I think that when, and I'll end on this, when Imran Khan makes a statement, the current prime minister makes a statement like Medina, the state of Medina, and uses this type of vocabulary and language in which he's talking about, yes, we need to take care of the weak, the oppressed, the poor in our societies, widows, orphans, etc. Now we have a class of Islam, and I use the term very clearly, Islamophobic secular liberal elites that are very allergic to this type of discourse, but it is precisely this type of a new language, a new vocabulary that kind of is required to advance this decolonial horizon. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Junaid. And next, we have Dr. Muhammad Ali Mirzai, who will be speaking. For those who are listening, he'll be speaking in Arabic, so you can listen on the Arabic channel. And then for those who are on the English channel, we'll get the Arabic translation in English. And the title of his talk is "Assessing Wilayat-e-Faqih 4 Decades Later in Iran."
نعم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. أبدأ أنا؟ نعم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قبل كل شيء أحب أن أتقدم بالشكر الجزيل لكل الذين قاموا وساهموا على إقامة وعقد هذه الندوة الطيبة والجيدة والضرورية في هذه الأوقات، واستفدنا كثيرا طبعا من الكلمات التي سبقت. اسمحوا لي أن أقدم لكلمتي بعض المقدمات الضرورية في البداية. المطلب الأول كمقدمة هو أن التقييم الذي جاء في عنوان كلمتي قد يكون تقييماً نظرياً لأجل معرفة مدى منطقية فكرة ولاية الفقيه أو مدى انسجامها النظري مع الفكر الإسلامي الأصيل، أو التقييم أن يكون تقييماً للمنجزات، تقييماً للذي تحقق في واقع الأمة الإيرانية وفي واقع هذه الدولة التي يعني تكرست عبر هذه النظرية، لأن نظرية ولاية الفقيه هي وضعت نوعا ما، هذه التجربة وضعت إيران بشكل كبير أمام تحديات في مستويات كثيرة، تحديات أمام الأوضاع في المنطقة في الإقليم، وتحديات أمام العالم الغربي طبعاً، وكذلك العالم الشرقي في تلك الفترة. هذه التحديات هي نتجت عن نظرية أم نتجت عن فعل الذي أسخط وأغضب العالم داخلاً وخارجاً، غرباً وشرقاً، حيث أصبحت هناك حرب شبه عالمية وكونية على هذه الفكرة. هل هي كانت حرباً وعداءً لنظرية ولاية الفقيه كنظرية في الفكر السياسي أم لا؟ هذا الرد العنيف العالمي نتج عن الحدث الذي وقع في إيران، وامتدت آثار هذا الحدث إلى خارج إيران أيضاً، وبالأحرى إصرار الإيرانيين على استعادة السيادة والاستقلال طبعاً، وكذلك إصرارهم على استعادة التنمية والتقدم وتحقيق هذه العناوين في هذا البلد. إذن التقييم كلمة أساسية في مداخلتي، وهذا التقييم باعتقادي يجب أن يكون في الجنبتين أو في الناحيتين، التقييم النظري والتقييم العملي. وأما فيما يتعلق طبعا بهذا الموضوع الحساس، علي أن أقدم أيضا بأن لا قداسة لهذه النظريات، لا قداسة لهذه النظريات، هي ليست الإسلام. لا يقول أحدنا أن نظرية ولاية الفقيه هي الإسلام، وإنما هي اجتهاد وهي إبداع فكري ومحاولة فكرية نظرية اجتهادية تخضع لكل ما يخضع له الفكر الإنساني من ضرورة المراجعات، لأنكم كما تعلمون أي فكرة لو لا تخضع للمراجعة ستموت، ستضعف وتخلو من يصبح فكرا جامدا. لو أصر أصحابه عليه سيتحول إلى فكرة عنفية عدوانية متصلبة متطرفة تكفيرية. إذا نحن نسحب صفة القدسية عن مثل هذه النظرية، ومنذ البداية هذه النظرية خضعت لتطورات لتحولات ولا تزال يجب أن تخضع لها. هل المراجعات التي تحققت حول هذه النظرية في داخل إيران هل كانت كافية؟ وهل كانت بمستوى التحديات العالمية النظرية والفلسفية في وجه هذه الفكرة؟ أنا أقول لكم كلا، لم تكن بهذا المستوى، ونحن نحتاج إلى مزيد من الجرأة الاجتهادية لأجل ترشيد هذه الفكرة أكثر. هذه مسألة كان مهمة لأقول لكم. لو قدسنا أي نظرية دينية يعني ألغينا إمكانية المراجعة، ألغينا إمكانية التقييم، ألغينا إمكانية الإصلاح والتغيير، وإذا نحن لا نفعل ذلك. في الواقع أحبتي أن العالم دائما، أنا أذكر فكرة أو رؤية أبداها ميشيل فوكو الفيلسوف الفرنسي المعروف في بدايات الثورة الإسلامية في إيران، وقال هذه الثورة تندرج ضمن الثورات ما بعد الحدثية. هذا تعبير ميشيل فوكو، ودائما انشغل ذهني لماذا قال ميشيل فوكو مثل هذا الكلام. أعتقد أن التجربة الإسلامية الإيرانية التي تحققت في ضوء هذه النظرية هي لم تكن تجربة تتوجه إلى الداخل المسلمين تتنافس مع المسلمين السنة مثلا أو غير الشيعة، وإنما كانت نظرية تهدف إلى إعادة بناء أمة في ضوء النظريات الإسلامية العامة. لم تكن هذه النظرية تتجذر في فكرة مذهب دون آخر. هذه حقيقة لو قرأنا عمق هذه النظرية لأدركناها. وبالمناسبة أن الأئمة الذين هم أئمة الإمامية المذهب الشيعي هم لم يحكم منهم إلا علي عليه السلام، وكان قد حكم المسلمين كخليفة، طبعا الخليفة الرابع، وأما باقي الأئمة يعني ما حكموا. إذن هذه النظرية التي تدعو المسلمين إلى أن يستعيدوا القرارات الاستراتيجية، إلى أن يستعيدوا الهيمنة على مصادرهم الإنسانية والطبيعية وخيراتهم الطبيعية، هذه النظرية لا يمكن أن تكون توجه السهم أو تتنافس إلى داخل الإسلامي، وهي تجربة ونظرية اجتهادية ينبغي اعتبارها جزءاً من الثروة الاجتهادية الإسلامية، لأن المذاهب كما تعلمون أحبتي هي نشأت وتكونت في ظروف شديدة التعقيد في التاريخ. أغلب الظن أن فلسفة تكوين هذه المذاهب كانت فلسفة سياسية ونوع من التحزب أو التحزيب للمسلمين. لكن اليوم علينا أن ننظر إلى هذه التجارب التي خرجت من هذه المذاهب في التفسير، في الكلام، في الفقه وفي الفكر السياسي. علينا أن ننظر إليها باعتبارها ثروة اجتماعية تاريخية. والآن يعني نظرا إلى الزمان، إلى الواقع الذي نعيش، إلى التحديات الحقيقية والاستحقاقات، علينا أن نعود ونبني هذه النظرية. مشكلة الإسلاميين، وهنا من الضروري الالتفات إلى هذه الملاحظات، لأن نظرية ولاية الفقيه في النهاية نظرية إسلامية أيضا. مشكلة الإسلاميين والذين لهم طموحات للتعاطي مع السلطة ومع السياسة، وأنا أعتبر هذه المشكلة من أهم المشاكل التي لولا نعالجها لا نستطيع تقييم حقيقي لتجربة السلطة السياسية في الإسلام أو لتجربة العلاقة بين السلطة وبين الدين عموما. ومن هنا طبعا تنشأ إشكاليات العلمانية وغيرها التي لا أعتقد لدي وقت لأخوضها. مشكلة الإسلاميين، ولا أقول المسلمين طبعا، أن لديهم رغبة في السلطة أكثر من أن يكون لديهم رغبة في التجديد الفكري والاجتهاد. اجتهاد الإسلاميين في الفقه والكلام وغيرها لا يزال يعني يدور في ضمن الاجتهادات التاريخية لبعض العلماء القدماء، لكن لديهم حرصا شديدا في التصدي للسلطة. أنا أعتقد هذه يؤدي إلى مشكلة حقيقية، لأن الفكر متأخر والرغبة في السلطة كبيرة. وهنا يضطر الإسلامي أن يقول نحن نقوم بدولة مدنية علمانية ولكن مرجعيتها مرجعية إسلامية. هذا للشعور بالضعف، لأن الفكر الذي لديه، لأن التجربة الاجتهادية التي لديه لا تفي بأغراض الزمن. السلطة الإسلامية اليوم تواجه أزمتين حقيقيتين، ونحن في خلال نظرية ولاية الفقيه حاول أصحاب هذه النظرية تجاوز هاتين الأزمتين. الأزمة الأولى هي تجربة تعطي المركزية للشريعة، يعني في الواقع يبدأون بفكرة تطبيق الشريعة. نظرية ولاية الفقيه لم تبدأ بهذه الفكرة، يعني لم يكن الشعارات والعناوين الرئيسية والاستراتيجيات الكبرى في الخطاب السياسي لهذه النظرية لم يكن فكرة تطبيق الشريعة، وإنما كانت الاستقلالية، السيادة، الحرية، الجمهورية، ومواجهة التحديات الكبرى في العالم كالاستعمار والإمبريالية والاحتلال ونهب ثروات المسلمين. الأدبيات كانت أدبيات يشبه إلى حد كبير تلك الأدبيات التي تبناها ما بعد الحداثيين في مواجهة الحداثة والدمار الذي تركته الحداثة في كل العالم. فكرة الاستعمار فكرة لا تزال قوية في المسلمين. أنا أعتقد المسلمون لم يخرجوا من نطاق الاستعمار. لذلك تركيا مثلا حينما تريد أن تأخذ قراراً سيادياً أساسياً فيما يتعلق بشراء نوع من الأسلحة من أي بلد تريد، لكن نرى أن هناك عقوبات تأتي لأن تركيا تريد أن تكون مستقلة وأن تأخذ قراراتها بنفسها. إذن المسلمون والبلاد الإسلامية لا تزال تعيش إلى حد كبير تحت سيطرة هذا الاستعمار، وهم لا يسمحون للدولة أن تكون مستقلة. أغلب الظن أن عددا كبيرا من هذه المنجزات تحققت. سأذكر بعض الإخفاقات أيضا طبعا، لكن اسمحوا لي أن أذكر بعض خصائص أو بعض المنجزات الأساسية ولو في عناوين كبيرة. طبعا من الناحية التنموية لا مقارنة بين إيران اليوم وإيران ما قبل الثورة الإسلامية في إيران. اليوم الحالة العلمية والقدرات التكنولوجية جعلت إيران من الدول 15 الأولى من الناحية العلمية، من ناحية ما يسمى بهاي تكنولوجي، يعني التقنيات العالية فيما يتعلق بالنانولوجيا، فيما يتعلق بالنووي، فيما يتعلق بالطب والعلوم الأخرى. هناك تطور علمي كبير. ومن الناحية التنمية في البلاد اليوم هناك حركة تنمية واسعة تصل إلى القرى النائية. اليوم 90% أو 95% من القرى النائية الإيرانية لديها الغاز بأرخص الأسعار طبعا، ولديها الكهرباء، ولديها كل إمكانيات الجديدة للتقنيات. نحن في داخل إيران لا نشعر بأن المهمة الكبرى لهذه الثورة كانت تطبيق الشريعة، وإنما كانت إعادة فهم المسلمين للشريعة حتى لا تلغي الشريعة الإنسان. الشريعة أدوات، وسيلة، لم تكن هدفا ولا يجب أن تكون هدفا. نحن لم نخلق لنطبق الشريعة، نحن خلقنا لنكبر بالشريعة. نحن لم نخلق لنكون مسلمين، وإنما خلقنا لنرتقي بالإسلام. إذن يجب أن يعود للإنسان، أن تعود له مركزيته وأهميته وقيمته العليا في الفكر الديني. أي قيمة للشريعة التي تجعل من الإنسان ضحية، وتجعل من المدن خرابا، وتجعل من المدنية والعقلانية وأمثال هذه الأمور أشياء مكروهة، أو أحيانا أشياء محرمة وأصحابها كفار. طب إذن هذه النظرية في الواقع أعطت قيمة كبيرة للتنمية، وكل العالم يسمعون الجوائز العالمية الكبرى التي يكتسبها الفنانون والعلماء الطب وعلماء النووي وفي علماء النانولوجيا وغير ذلك. أنا قرأت بعض التقارير التي تقول أن التطور العلمي في إيران بلغت مستوى الدولة 15 في العالم، يعني من الناحية العلمية وصلنا إلى مراتب جيدة. أنا لا أقول أحبتي إخواني وأخواتي، أنا لا أقول أن لا مشكلات، لا، لدينا مشكلات، لدينا نقاط ضعف، ولكن العداء العالمي كبير أيضا. أنا تابعت كلمات الرئيس الماليزي، رئيس وزراء الماليزي السابق الأستاذ محمد. قرأت له أنه يقول لا يسمح لنا أن نساعد الفلسطينيين إلا في إطار محدود، وهذا بالصدق قاله طبعا. لكن الإيرانيون مصرون على بعض القضايا التي هي مكلفة. في الواقع الشعب الإيراني والنظام الإيراني والدولة الإيرانية هي تصر على بعض العناوين التي أثمانها غالية. هي لا علاقة لها بعدم كفاءة النظريات التي بنيت عليها هذه التجربة، وإنما لها علاقة بالمواجهة. نحن رأينا في تركيا الجارة العزيزة التي نفتخر بالعلاقات الاستراتيجية المهمة معها، وسنستمر في تعزيز هذه العلاقات طبعا. رأينا أن الليرة التركية نزلت وهبطت 3 مرات ممكن أو مرتين بشكل مذهل لمجرد بعض الإشكاليات العالمية. إذن نحن أمام إمبريالية وحشية وبربرية لا تريد أن يتحرك الدول إلا وفقا لبوصلتها، ولكن إيران لا تريد أن تكون ذلك، وهذا لا علاقة بفكرة إشكالية النظرية. أرجو تذكيري إذا انتهى وقتي حتى أتوقف. نظرية ولاية الفقيه في الحقيقة لو نظرنا إلى البنى التحتية لهذه النظرية يجب أن نتجاوز فكرة المذاهب إلى فكرة النبوة السياسية أو النبوة الإسلامية النبوية المحمدية التي كانت تمارس السلطة. كذلك بعد النبوة لدينا خلفاء. الخلفاء كلهم حكموا، لكن النظر إلى أن فكرة السياسة المحمدية هي فكرة طوبوية، وبل أكثر من ذلك. أنا قرأت للأستاذ محمد الأستاذ عبد الله العروي يقول
دكتور علي إذا سمحت، دكتور علي إذا سمحت، هل الميوت تحت العربي في الانتربريتيشن ميوت اوريجينال اوديو عندك؟
Dr. Mingrai, you have 2 minutes.
لو سمحت تحت في العربي تحت ميوت اوريجينال اوديو لو تكرمت.
في بلا
ميوت. ها
نعم
شكرا، تفضل استمر.
انا يعني اكبس على هذا.
نعم اكبس على ميوت اوريجينال اوديو.
الان كبست عليه.
تمام شكرا جزيلا.
عفوا. فهناك في الحقيقة ما أحب أن أقول أن هناك إشكاليات تثار، ولكن هذه الإشكاليات في نسبة كبيرة منها لا تعود إلى النظرية، وإنما تعود إلى الشبكة الصدامية للعلاقات بين التجربة العملية وبين العالم. عندما كان قبل الثورة الإسلامية في إيران وقبل نظرية ولاية الفقيه، كان الشاه هو يمثل القلب والمركز والخط الأمامي للمصالح الأمريكية في المنطقة، وكانت طهران الحليفة الاستراتيجية الأولى والأهم لإسرائيل، ولم يكن للعالم أي مشكلة طبعا مع إيران. ولكن بعدما تغيرت هذه المعادلات وانقلبت هذه المعادلات، فأصبحت المواقف من طهران هي باتجاه العرب والمسلمين، وباتجاه فكرة الوحدة الإسلامية، وباتجاه المعاداة لإسرائيل للاحتلال الإسرائيلي. طبعا هنا انقلبت كل المواقف، وهنا أيضا شنت حرب عالمية لتشويه صورة هذه النظرية. وإلا هذه النظرية لابد أن نلتفت إلى أنها لا تدخل في التفاصيل الإجرائية. وهنا اسمحوا لي أن أذكر 3 أشياء مهمة جدا في ضوء هذه النظرية تحققت في إيران، وهذه الأشياء ال3 ليست مسبوقة فيما أعرف في التجارب الإسلامية السياسية. التجربة الأولى أحبتي هي تجربة دسترة الفكر الإسلامي. بعد انتصار الثورة الإسلامية في إيران تدستر الفكر لو صح التعبير، أصبح الفكر في قالب وصورة الدستور، أصبح الفكر دستورا. لم نستند في قراراتنا إلى الأحاديث وإنما إلى البنود الدستورية. نعم الدستور خضع لاجتهادات جماعية، سأتحدث عن هذا التجربة الاجتهاد الجماعي وأهميته وفشل الاجتهاد الفردي في الفكر السياسي، ويجب أن يتخلى المسلمون عن الاجتهادات الفردية. طبعا الأفكار الأساسية القرآنية وسيرة النبي صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم هي تحولت من الناحية الفلسفية الأساسية ومن الناحية المقاصدية تحولت إلى الدستور. إذن تجربة الدستور التي ولدت بعد الثورة ب3-4 أشهر هي تجربة مهمة، لكن حتى هذه التجربة لم تكن مقدسة. هذه التجربة كان اجتهادا من الفقهاء، وخضعت هذه التجربة تجربة الدستور لتطورات ولتعديلات في حياة الإمام الخميني وبعده أيضا، ويجب أن تخضع أيضا لتعديلات. إذن الدستورية الإسلامية كانت تجربة جميلة ومهمة. العلاقة أو تجسير العلاقة وتشبيك العلاقة بين الإسلام كفكرة وبين التقنين كأداة لإدارة الحياة. ولا يمكن إدارة الحياة بقراءة صحيح مسلم وبخاري أو بقراءة أحاديث الكافي. الحياة تدار من خلال منطق تقنيني جديد يتناسب مع متطلبات الحياة. إذن مسألة الدسترة كان إنجازا مهما ويجب أن تتطور طبعا. المسألة الثانية هي مسألة المأسسة. إخواني اسمحوا لي أن أقول لكم الصورة التي تقدم عن إيران وعن ولاية الفقيه إلى العالم صورة لا تتطابق مع الواقع الذي نعيشه. أنا أعطيكم مثالا. كل العلاقة بين المؤسسة الدينية أو بين الفكرة الدينية، لأننا لا نعترف بأن المؤسسة الدينية يجب أن تحكم، هذه فكرة مسيحية نحن لا نقبل بها. حتى حكم الرجال الدين وعلماء الدين، نحن لا نقول بحكم رجال الدين أو بحكم علماء الدين، نحن لسنا ثيوقراطيين. هذه تجربة ليست تجربة حكم الإله وليست تجربة حاكمية الله. البشر هو الحاكم وليس الله، لكن البشر.
دكتور علي،
نعم،
إذا ممكن تختم في دقيقتين لو تكرمت.
نعم إن شاء الله، إن شاء الله. البشر يحكم بعقله، ولكن في ضوء الفكرة الدينية الكبرى، في ضوء القواعد الأساسية القرآنية وفي ضوء القواعد الأساسية للإسلام. إذن المؤسسة تحولت إلى مؤسسات ثلاثة. المؤسسة الأولى هي مؤسسة صيانة الدستور. مؤسسة صيانة الدستور فقهاء 6 والنخب ودكاترة من الحقوقيين والقانونيين أيضا 6. هؤلاء فقط يراعون جانب تطابق القوانين مع كليات الشريعة، ليس أكثر، لا يتدخلون في شأن آخر. ومجمع اختيار مجمع خبراء القيادة. وأنهي طبعا من خلال جمل قصيرة حول هاتين المؤسستين. مجمع خبراء القيادة إخواني أخواتي، هذا المجمع المجتهدون فيه يجب أن يختاروا من الشعب، وهذا المجمع يختار القائد والولي الفقيه ويعزله، يعني له قدرة الاختيار وله قدرة العزل للولي الفقيه. والمؤسسة الأخيرة هي مؤسسة مجمع تشخيص مصلحة النظام. هذه المؤسسة هي متشكلة من جميع القيادات والفقهائية والدينية، وتجري حركة اجتهادية دينية وقانونية وواقعية. نظرية ولاية الفقيه هي نظرية مؤسساتية وليست ترتكز إلى قرارات الولي الفقيه الشخص. أعتذر إن أطلت، والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for your presentation. And finally, we have Dr. Mohammed Marandi, who will be speaking on Iran's foreign policy. And he'll be speaking for 10 minutes, and then we'll go to a round of questions for each speaker, and then we'll conclude the panel. Dr. Marandi? You can start.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Yes, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we are hearing you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you for the invitation. I was informed very late about this conference. I'm sort of like when you can't find the main people are not available or something happens to them, they invite me to replace them. So I'm not an expert as some of my colleagues, but I'll try to give a summary of what I think are some of the key elements in Iranian foreign policy. I think there is a combination of both idealism and realism in Iranian foreign policy. There are certain principles that the Islamic Republic adheres to, and those are based upon the Constitution, Islam, independence, and freedom within the cultural and religious boundaries of Islam as defined by the Iranian Constitution. On the other hand, Iran has to be a practical player on the world stage, And because of the complexities of this region and the role that the United States has been playing for decades in this part of the world, this is something that is very difficult and sophisticated and complicated for the Iranians to deal with. The United States, as we all know, has a special focus on Iran, and the belief is that it's in Tehran, that it's basically because of Iran's revolution, Iran's independence from the Western Bloc, and of course the Eastern Bloc, the Soviet Union at that time, existed. And in addition to that, Iran's rejection of the Israeli regime as an apartheid regime, identical to Iran's policy towards apartheid South Africa. And in the view of Tehran, these are two unforgivable sins of Iran that the United States and its Western allies have never forgiven, and there doesn't seem to be any real sign that it will be forgiven. As we see in the Constitution, Iran has a very complicated state, and Wali Faqih, the person, the leader, he must be a religious figure who is a mujtahid, a person who is able to interpret a legal Islamic, a scholar in Islamic law. And he is not someone who is elected directly. He does not lobby he did not lobby to become leader. The council of experts chose him, and he began to lead. This has a unique element to it, because since he did not and does not need to be re-elected, he is not the sort of everyday politician that you see that has to attract public opinion. He is answerable to the council that chose him. That council is chosen every 8 years. On the other hand, you have a directly elected president, a directly elected parliament, and city councils, which are also directly elected, and they have their own dynamics. Because they're elected directly, they constantly have to interact with public. Often you will have politicians who will obviously be dishonest, make enormous claims, or speak of high ambitions that are unattainable in order to attract the vote. So this, I think, creates a very interesting dynamic for Iranian politics, because on the one hand, it is like everywhere else in the world, very messy, and you constantly have shifts and changes in Iranian policy, both domestic and foreign policy, because of the shifts and changes in different administrations and parliament. But at the same time, you have a sort of umbrella that the leader provides that sort of keeps the ship afloat and creates a sense of continuity at the same time, because he does not rule based upon on the emotions of the ordinary public, because, as I said, there are no direct elections, and the leader is not someone who is out to be elected. He is chosen by his peers. So my argument has always been, and this is something that my Western colleagues often like to disagree with, but I think the passage of time has shown them to be not so correct. And that is that the system that has been devised as a result of the constitution in Iran has shown a great deal of resilience and has created a great deal of stability in the country. After the demise of Imam Khomeini, Ayatollah Khamenei became the leader. At that time, there was a great deal of speculation in the West that when the leader, Imam Khomeini, passed away, that would be the end of the Islamic Revolution. Well, we saw how the constitution functioned, and we had a leader to replace him. And over the past 3 decades, we've had from the Western powers sanctions and regional animosity, terrorism, military attacks, and threats to Iran's security and threats to the security of Iran's regional friends and alliances. Yet despite that, and despite all the predictions that the Islamic Republic of Iran will, United States, and this is something that I've discussed repeatedly with colleagues in the West over the past 4 years, in particular, during the 4 years of Trump's crippling sanctions, or what he calls brutal sanctions. They brutalized the Iranian population. I repeatedly told Western colleagues that Iran is not going to submit to the United States, that Iran will not appease the United States, that it will not accept any changes to the nuclear deal, nor will it give any concessions to the United States beyond what has already been negotiated within the JCPOA or the nuclear deal. And what I have been saying repeatedly for the past 4 years has repeatedly and constantly been met with skepticism by my Western colleagues. And they have constantly said that, this is bluster and that Iran has no option but to submit to the United States. But 4 years of Trump's reign has almost come to an end. And unless something drastic and dramatic takes place over the next few weeks, I think it's becoming quite clear that the United States, despite the hardship that it has imposed on ordinary Iranians, that it has not forced or has not been able to force Iran to submit. And I would argue that that is because of the resilience of the Iranian constitution and the Iranian political system. Many would like to say that the Iranian political system, in it, there's no real authority in parliament and everything is decided by the leader. And I think after 4 decades, that narrative has shown itself to be utterly discredited because Western governments constantly worry about who will be the next president in Iran, what will the next parliament be like. Yet at the same time, they like to say that in Iran, these things don't matter. It's sort of like they want to have their cake and eat it too. On the one hand, they want to say that in Iran, there's no openness, there's no democracy, there's no freedom, there's no competition. But on the other hand, they're constantly fearful about how their policies, or they're concerned about how their policies will influence the dynamics in Iran. So I think it would be fair to say that there's a strong element of there's a strong dynamic element both in Iranian internal policy as well as in Iranian foreign policy. And that has shown significant changes in the way in which Iran has interacted with the international community, but of course, Western countries in particular, and in particular, the United States. So while we had, for example, under the current leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, we've had 4 different administrations with 4 very different policies. Ayatollah Rafsanjani had his own policies, then Mr. Khatami had his own policies, then Mr. Ahmadinejad had his own policies, and Dr. Rouhani his own. All 4 of them are very distinct from one another, both domestic and foreign policy. But at the same time, while the leader has been very flexible in allowing, especially during first terms, this is, I think, by now a tradition in Iran. During the first term, usually the president has greater leeway, and in the second term, or during his second term, the leader gradually narrows down the scope in which the president can shift foreign policy. Because usually when the new president comes, he wants to do something new, and the leader, the Supreme National Security Council, other bodies usually stand back and let him do what he does. And then gradually, after he either succeeds or fails in trying to achieve whatever it is he's trying to achieve, then the system goes back to, let's say, a more predictable path, depending on the outcomes of the new policies. So what I would like to stress is that the Iranian foreign policy is both dynamic, and that dynamic element of Iranian foreign policy has been very clear during the 4 different presidencies that we've seen over the last 3 decades. But at the same time, there's a strong sense of continuity as well. And that is where I think Iran's policy towards the United States, Iran's policy towards the Israeli regime, and Iranian policy towards the region and the international community it becomes clearer. On the one hand, Iran has dealt with the United States in different ways during different administrations. Thus, so for example, during the Khatami administration, the Iranians showed, I think, greater flexibility. During the Rouhani administration, Iran showed greater flexibility. But during the Ahmadinejad administration, Iran showed less flexibility. But at the same time, what is important is that Iran continued to try to find solutions with the United States during all of these administrations, even though all of the four different administrations were quite distinct from each other. During Mr. Rafsanjani's era, Iran gave an oil field to Conoco Oil Company of the United States. Mr. Rafsanjani at that time said that was a green light to the United States to tell them that we are willing to overcome our differences, but the United States slammed sanctions on Iran immediately after the oil field was given. Then during the Khatami administration, after 9/11, Iran cooperated with the United States against Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. And of course, Iran was subsequently called an axis of evil. And then after that, Iran negotiated with the United States in Iraq, in the presence of the Iraqi government. The Americans wanted to exclude Iraq, but the Iranians insisted that without the Iraqi government, they will not negotiate with the United States. But again, there, the United States did not show flexibility. And of course, during the war, during the Iran-Iraq war, the American hostages in Lebanon, the Americans made a request for Iran to help secure their release. The Iranians did that, and the Iranians were again betrayed by the Americans. Then under the Ahmadinejad administration came the Oman talks, which later on led to the nuclear agreement. And what I want to point out is that actually President Ahmadinejad and the Supreme National Security Council at that time was opposed to the Oman talks. Obama sent a letter to Iran after Iran began enriching uranium at 20% that he will recognize Iran's right to uranium. He implied that in his letter, and the leader, with reluctance, agreed to the proposal of the then Foreign Minister, Dr. Salehi, to begin negotiations. And then after President Rouhani came to power, he continued those negotiations until we had the nuclear deal. So the point that I want to make is that Iran's regional policy is, as I said before, based upon certain principles, but there's a great deal of flexibility at the same time. The number one principle for Iran in this region, I would say, that is contentious, is Iran's utter rejection of the Israeli regime. Iran's policy towards Israel is unique in this region. Unlike Turkey, which has an Israeli embassy, it has direct flights, it does trade, or unlike Saudi Arabia, which has a relationship that is known, but it's not in the open. And the dynamics that we're seeing now, or the relationship in Egypt or in Jordan, Iran's position towards Israel is that Israel must cease to exist, and that Israel is an apartheid state, and therefore it lacks moral legitimacy. Iran's policy towards Israel is identical to its policy towards apartheid South Africa. With regards to apartheid South Africa, Iran's position was that it was morally illegitimate and that it must cease to exist. And ultimately, after apartheid South Africa collapsed, Iran established full ties with that country. And I should remind my colleagues that during the period when Iran was supporting the ANC and Nelson Mandela, as well as other resistance groups in South Africa and the resistance front in the southern part of Africa, the ANC was a terrorist organization in accordance with US law. And Nelson Mandela was a terrorist according to US law. And of course, European laws they were in different European countries, they had different relations with South Africa, but in general, Western European countries had a very negative view of the resistance. And the interesting thing is that after Nelson Mandela was released.
Sorry, Dr. Marandi, if you could conclude in
I'm sorry, your voice is breaking.
2 minute warning.
Sure. So okay, sure. After Nelson Mandela was released, after he became president, after his term in office ended, and after he retired from politics, he was still, according to American law, a terrorist. And only in 2008 was he removed from the US terrorist list, and so was the ANC. In 2008, years after his presidency, many years after his presidency ended. So the belief in Tehran is that just as apartheid South Africa ultimately came to an end and ceased to exist, that apartheid in Palestine will cease to exist. And especially since the Europeans and the Americans have been for many years been talking about the two-state solution. But as time has gone on, they've allowed the Israeli regime to colonize the West Bank. The two-state solution is effectively dead. And as a result of the foolish policies of the Israeli regime, now the Palestinian people are stuck in a situation where there's no hope for a state in the West Bank. There's no realistic hope, but at the same time, they are not considered as citizens. So therefore, Palestine is becoming, as time goes by, increasingly openly similar to apartheid South Africa. So the Iranians, contrary to the skepticism and the pessimism that exists among many of our colleagues, believe that time is not on the side of the Israeli regime. And therefore, while many say that Iran's policy in this region and its animosity towards the apartheid regime and towards the US presence in the region, that this will not bear fruit and it is only creating difficulty for Iran, the belief is that with the passage of time, the situation will work or move towards the detriment of the United States. And that the United States, especially now that the United States is facing increasing difficulty at home, the optimism in Iran, despite the difficulties that exist today, is increasing with regards to the capability of the country to deal in a more firmer way, in a more successful way, in a more, let's say, aggressive way, if I could say, towards the US regional hegemonic ambitions and the Israeli regime as well.
Okay, thank you so much. Are you able to get on the English channel so we can all, so you can hear all of the other speakers and the questions? You'll see it under interpretation. Okay. Thank you. Thanks to everyone for sticking with us so far. So we'll be extending this panel till about another half an hour, just so that we can get some question and answers in. So I'll ask maybe 1 or 2 questions for all of our speakers, and they have 5 minutes. And to please try to keep that time limit, 5 minutes, to just give some of their concluding thoughts. So I'll just get started with Dr. Balut. The first question is, as an economic historian, how can Turkey, which is structurally a Eurocentric economy, survive in a global economy that is returning to the Indian Ocean and increasingly to Asia? And also, what potential does Turkey as a global economic power have for politics in the Muslim world? And what can other Muslim countries learn from Turkey's shift away from international financial institutions? For Dr. Ersoy, how do we understand the complex relationship between the US and Turkey? Does Turkey have a policy to lead the Muslim world? And if yes, how? And also, what evidence do you have to substantiate the claim that the current currency crisis in Turkey is the result of foreign interference and not fiscal mismanagement? For Dr. Hussein, As a critical legal historian, what are the top 3 legal obstacles that make implementing Islamic law, again, in post-colonial countries impossible? And you pointed to British India being a laboratory to test imperial legal experiment with Islamic law. Can we think of the history of de-Sharification in the context of global legal history? If so, would there be connections between the colonial legal practices you write about and the general global process ending in what some have called the global liberal constitutional movement? For Junaid, Dr. Junaid, what is your assessment of recent Muslim movements in Pakistan that have put pressure on the current Imran Khan government? So it's not, the pushback is not just coming from secular liberals. What's their reason for contesting the present government? And also, to what extent can Pakistan resist the emerging pressure to recognize Israel? I know you've been doing some activism around that. And there are justifications that some in Pakistan have used, giving reference to agreements between the Prophet Muhammad with Jews to normalize relations with Israel. So how can Pakistan kind of move beyond this? For Dr. Ali, you mentioned that sovereignty finds its root in the prophecy of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. How do you assess the argument that sovereignty belongs to God, as was argued by Maududi, or that sovereignty belongs to man? And the second question is, how can Iran come out of international isolation? What are the alliances and partnerships, including in the Muslim world, that it can build on? And then finally, for Dr. Marandi, the question is about in relation to the Biden presidency, and what are the opportunities and obstacles that you see in terms of relations with the United States in the next 4 years? So if we could start with Dr. Balut, and then we'll go in order again. And again, remember to please keep it to 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. I will try. Thank you again for these good questions. The first one is maybe one of the most important questions for all of us, Eurocentric view about our, history, about our economic developments. And I think this Eurocentric view is very critical. If we could not understand the reality within this paradigm, we could not understand our realities. Let me tell you that for the European expansion of to East and West, the history is starting for them at that time. As you know, Adam Smith strongly states in his book, the 2 most important events in history are the following. The Europeans reached to American continent and reach around Cape Town to Asia. This is maybe for Europeans, it can be the most important 2 events. You can understand the Eurocentric view from this, and starting to the establishment of a new paradigm, the rise of the West and decline of the rest from, the beginning of 16th century. But recent research show us that just, not just for Ottoman Empire, for China, let's see, when you look at the Kenneth Pomeranz book on the Great Divergence, you will see that in the middle of 19th century, China's Yangtze Delta is richer than Manchester and London. When we look at the Ottoman side, I am sure till the middle of 19th century, economically, just maybe 2 very small parts of Europe, just very small states, the Netherlands, like a city of Konya, very small in the west, in the Atlantic coast, and the other one is United Kingdom, it is also the small state, except these two states, the Ottoman economic growth, economic welfare, when you look at the Marshall Hodgson's explanations in his book on Venture of Islam, you will see that, during the early modern times, the Ottoman system is very different. But anyway, what I would like to stress, connected to the second question, till the beginning of 20th century, when you look at the last time of Ottoman Empire, Abdülhamid era, the second Abdülhamid, Sultan Abdülhamid Han, he resigned in 1909. Till that time, there is a big, economic development based on our sovereignty and independence. When the Ottomans made decision in all aspects, but of course based on their own paradigm, different than Homo economicus. They were altruists. They were Homo ethicus rather than Homo economicus, different economic paradigm. Based on their economic paradigm, they grow day by day by normal economic growth. Come to the Turkey, what kind of lessons can be taken from Turkey? Just, I would like to stress, Turkey was under the control for a century. Again, I am saying Turkey was under the control. When, if we can make a decision independently in our mentality, in our thinking, in our behaviors, if we have freedom of thinking, freedom of believing, freedom of entrepreneurship, so we can do. Turkey showed this example in, in recent times, in the time of Turgut Özal, in the time of Necmettin Erbakan, and especially in recent times, President Erdogan, in his time, we experienced that if the Muslim countries can make decision independently, they can succeed, they can do, and I hope we can do. And more thing, please, as intellectuals, we have to, be independent. Of course, we will take the knowledge, the wisdom from all of the world. Where is the wisdom? Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, if it's in China, you can get it. We can use it, we can get it. But for our countries, we have to think about independently. And also for all Muslims, intellectuals, political actors, economic actors, the unity, tawheed, and justice is very critical. Doing politics in daily issue and, to create some new complaints among the Muslims is not good. This is my message. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Dr. Ersoy?
Okay. Well, after a long break, welcome to the Q&A session again. Let me start with the easy question so that I can have more time for the more serious question to answer. Regarding the Turkish currency, deflation against the devaluation against the dollar, yes, it is entirely because of the external interference into the Turkish economy. And this is not my words. This is not my allegation. This is actually said quite openly by the president of USA, Trump himself. He said when we had, as we so often are having some crisis with the USA, in one of the occasions, just few weeks ago, not few weeks, few months ago, he said, I am prepared to crush the Turkish economy once again if they don't consider our concerns about whatever the crisis on agenda it was. So it was his own statement. He said, we will play with the Turkish currency once again and blow up the Turkish economy. Up until then, including myself, so many experts used to claim that, or used to believe that the economic mismanagement may have some kinds of impact on this devaluation of the Turkish currency. But with such statements, very clearly prove that, yes, indeed, it was because of the result of the external interference into the Turkish economy. Coming to the more comprehensive question about the Turkish relations with the USA, well, they don't have the luxury to just play with the relations the way they want, because there are so many instruments to play in the game. Because Turkey has a very strong connection with the EU. It's an official candidate to become full member of the EU. Whether it takes long or short, that's beyond our concern. But Turkey is in the process to become full member of the EU. And USA must consider this point. Second, Turkey is founding member of the NATO itself, and the second largest army, or the second most powerful member of the NATO itself. And without Turkish army, NATO may not easily have the operations at global levels. They are well aware of this connection. And again, the third instrument is Turkish presence in Caucasian and Central Asian republics. It's not that easy for the USA to have strong bonds with the Central Asian republics and have their presence in Central Asia, as we have seen recently in the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. When Russia and Turkey agrees on any point, they can easily leave out the USA out of the crisis management process. That's a typical example that we observed recently. Again, Turkish connection with the Middle East and with the Islamic countries through OIC or even beyond. The Americans are well aware of the Turkish impact on the Muslim countries, ranging from Morocco to Indonesia. And that's why it wouldn't be that easy for the Americans to have the luxury to deteriorate the relations beyond a limit. And finally, in the Mediterranean region, we have warm waters, which are quite appealing to the Russian Federation. And it has been centuries-long dream of the Russians to penetrate to reach the warm waters of the Mediterranean. And Turkey is almost the only country which can obstruct them, prevent them to have the penetration into the region. That's why, in my personal humble opinion, yes, from time to time, we can have a limited, well-controlled, well-balanced deterioration of the relations between the two powers. But as Turkey is emerging as a major power, even attempting to move from a regional power to a global power, together with Chinese penetration into the Middle East through Central Asian republics, they are well aware of the fact that without having Turkey as a friend, as an ally, they can never have the chance to contain Russian Federation to the north and to prevent China to penetrate into the Central Asian republics, as well as the Middle East and even beyond, including Europe. You may have read from the news coverage about the second train, this time not moving from Beijing to Europe, but this time the other way around, from Istanbul to Beijing. It's now, I think, in Kazakhstan. I am following every day where it reaches. So this is a symbol. This is a symbolic sign and message to the USA. Unless you improve your relations, it's you to lose, not ourselves. So I am sure it will work. There are so many other indicators that it's not that easy for the USA to worsen the relations with Turkey. So they will keep up between a margin, and from time to time, it will fluctuate, but at the end of the day, it will be within a limit that is tolerable. That's all what I could say in this regard. And regarding the Turkish relations with the Islamic countries, Turkey is not going to leave the Islamic countries behind its national objectives. Turkey is improving its relations not only with the EU, with the Western countries, the relations with the Islamic countries through OIC or through other channels are always open, and they are doing their best. The Turkish diplomats, as well as decision makers, are doing their best to improve the relations with the Islamic countries on all matters on their agenda. So there is no deterioration in that regard at all. The Turkish presence in Syria, in Libya, in Somalia, they're going to contribute positively, not negatively, vis-a-vis relations with Islamic countries, with some exceptions, of course.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Ersoy. And Dr. Hussein.
Thank you. So there were two questions, one of which dealt with the question of de-Shariafication, colonialism, and global liberal constitutionalism, and the other two, sort of the question of obstacles to the implementation of Islamic law or its extension. And given the lack of time, I'm going to condense them together and pull out one thread of that, which is to say that it seems to me that the fundamental historical impact of the colonial period on Muslim states and societies has been the association of Islam with the positive law of the state, at the expense of the association of Islam in the cultural, educational, scientific, and ethical institutions of Muslim life, which has impoverished all Muslims in the present period, but in particular has sort of led to a kind of reification of the state as a kind of repository for Islamic authority and Islamic identity, which I think is needs both scholarly and political address, right? And as a matter of scholarly practice, this means putting the law and the state back into its place, alongside, not over, institutions of Muslim culture, science, debate, and exchange. And to say that we remember a history in which the Muslim state and the Muslim nation state did not monopolize debate on Islam or Muslim life, did not see itself as the end point arbiter of Islamic law, and was instead, part of a lively full of disagreement, full of multiple different kinds of epistemologies and schools of thought, allowing different kinds of goals to be achieved and questions to be asked. And so that the first step in critical legal studies in this moment of trying to put the law and the state back into its place is to historicize how the state and the law came to monopolize a claim to Islam and its authority as a venue for politics. And so the question about global liberal constitutionalism comes back to that in some ways, because global liberal constitutionalism and the idea that the extension of Islam through law should be the kind of fundamental mandate of political activity are both investments in the modern nation state and its institutions of sovereignty. And I'd like to just push back against that in favor of considering ways in which we might reinvigorate institutions, educations, and habits of mind and society that allow for mutual engagement and disagreement amongst Muslims and non-Muslims in the nation state, and the valuing and prioritizing of an ethic of Islamic debate rather than the implementation or extension of Islam through law. I don't have a great deal more to add to that very rich and deep question, rather than to say that the project of historicizing the colonial and its contribution to making what we think of now as the Islamic through the state is one of the first steps to that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ahmed.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Kandrol, for those two questions. Let me get to the first one. Recent Muslim movements contesting the government. People may have been following these massive rallies that have taken place. The PDM, Pakistan Democratic Movement, of basically the politicians that have been governing this country since civilians have been in power in this country, and which is one of the reasons why I took great pleasure in skipping over the 1990s, because it's actually a very depressing period in which a developing country like Pakistan was so plundered and looted by two family dynasties. You can basically call them the House of Bhutto Zardari and the House of the Sharifs. And these, of course, are the two main political parties that have joined in a coalition and are mobilizing anyone and everyone that they can get their hands on to join on board, including Maulana Fazlur Rahman, who is called Maulana Diesel by everybody because of his well-known corruption in terms of in his areas in KPK. Nothing like his father was Mufti Mahmood, who actually allied with the PPP in the early 70s, a very kind of a principled political figure. But so these are the key figures in that movement, but they have also tried to lag on to other kind of grievances as well in the country. And so what all that I have to say to this is that there's just 2 points. One is that we're dealing with a deeply entrenched political system in Pakistan that has, certainly since the 1990s, since the end of kind of the Zia-ul-Haq's rule and certain. So when Musharraf's coup happened in 1999 and Nawaz Sharif was in power then, and I was actually in the country, there were not people out in the streets protesting and rallying. For the most part, people were just indifferent or glad that he was ousted, which tells you something. This is something that I often say, is that what Pakistan has been really cursed with, people want to talk about military rule, that's fine, of course. But what it's really been cursed with is also some of the most corrupt politicians that one can imagine in the developing world. And I know that people, I mean, it's so corrupt that in fact, these politicians get angry. They would, Transparency International would have these lists of kind of the most corrupt countries in the world, and these Pakistani politicians would get angry that when Nigeria would be number one and Pakistan would be number two, and then they would think that, can't we bribe Transparency somehow to make us number one? I mean, this is the nature. This is the really sad and pathetic nature of these class of politicians into which Imran Khan's political party and he himself has inserted. Now, Imran Khan himself, I mean, deeply kind of respected man of integrity. His political party, yes, many of the old kind of guards and politicals are in that political party as well. And so there is an entire class of these politicians right now that are trying to capitalize on a moment of unity in which they can, all of these kind of elite elements can basically go after Imran. Once Imran is done, the kind of rhetoric of basically, the rhetoric is not just about Imran now. The rhetoric is about, okay, we want the quote unquote deep state, the military out of politics. When all of these political parties, they have deeply cooperated, been dependent upon that same military establishment. In fact, the Pakistan Muslim League was created by that military establishment. So first of all, I mean, it's all kind of rhetorical hypocrisy. The one person right now, we also see a very kind of vibrant movement of the people of the Northwest, of Pathans, who have been deeply affected by the war on terror, by military operations, displacement, and so on. The one individual since 2001, up until, I mean, basically becoming prime minister, who spoke out consistently opposing both the war on terror in general, the way the US was waging it, as well as Pakistan going into the Northwest and engaging, was Imran Khan. None of these political parties had anything to say. They could care less. And of course, they're capitalizing on that as well right now. So I think that the movement is not internally internally bankrupt. And again, when we talk about these principled Democrats trying to oppose this Imran Khan, who they think is a stooge of the military, I mean, how can we consider the House of Sharif? For example, we all grieve for the assassination of the Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto, but in her will, she bequeaths her political party to her son until he comes of age, and to her husband. That this is the internal democracy that operates in these political parties. So in terms of in their democratic credentials, there's a lot to be said for. So, and again, none of this is to be apologetic for. Again, the mismanagement on the part of the government on certain things. But one more thing I'll add to that, and that is an intense level of what is now, I mean, my good friend Sher Ali Tareen calls Imranophobia. Imranophobia. This man who has been able to engage the West, who has lived in the West, has come back, wants to speak of development and human rights, all of these things. But again, it's about a different vocabulary. Why is he not speaking the NGO speak, the liberal secular narrative that we're all used to, that we want, that we have been taught and socialized to speak in our English, in our elite English medium schools, etc.? Why is he wearing a kurta shalwar kameez rather than a suit and tie or whatever? All of these things deeply psychologically disturb an Islamophobic secular liberal elite, which are all of them. And if you read the press from now, and the talk about Pakistan being like this fascist totality, read all of the English language press. If this was really a fascist state, and you read this press constantly criticizing both the military establishment in Imran, I mean, that's just a joke. So I think that there are genuine grievances, but I think that to depend on particularly those two mainstream political parties to be at the forefront of some type of a democratic movement is just a farce. The second thing was,
I'm so sorry, Junaid. We'll have to go to the next speaker because we're really running out of time.
Oh gosh, I just wanted to say astaghfirullah on the question of comparing Pakistan's normalization with Israel and what the Prophet, peace be upon him, the type of covenant he wanted to reach with the different communities. I just want to say astaghfirullah to that because it's absolutely no comparison whatsoever. Then I'll stop there.
Absolutely. Dr. Ali.
I think Dr. Ali may have to leave.
He has to leave?
He had to leave because there is a curfew also that he had to go.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Dr.
نعم.
Oh, no, here he is. Okay.
Yes, please go ahead.
هل أنا أتحدث؟
Yes. نعم.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. طبعا شكرا على توجيه هذين السؤالين. في السؤال الأول اسمحوا لي أن أقول لما توفي محمد صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم ورث المسلمون منه حكم المدينة، فأصبحت التجربة المحمدية تجلى البعد السياسي في مشروع الخلافة، ولكن فكرة النبوة لم يتم استحضارها بقوة في بناء الفكر السياسي. هذه المسألة الأولى. أنا أتحدث عن مشكلة فكرة الحاكمية على طريقة الإسلام السياسي طبعا. فوجد المسلمون سلطة يعني بيد المسلمين، وأما الإسلام كوحي وكتجربة محمدية في السياسة لم تتحول إلى المرجعية العليا للفكر السياسي الإسلامي إلى اليوم. لذلك كما قلت اعتبرت تجربة رسول الله وكأنها تجربة مثالية علينا تجاوزها، وتجربة السياسية الخلافية أو الخلافة أيضا مثالية. واليوم مع الأسف الشديد وصلنا إلى إسلام سياسي محروم إلى حد كبير من التطوير الفكري. النقطة الثانية هي مشكلة الحاكمية المودودية لو صح التعبير، هي تصور أن هناك قوانين إسلامية في السياسة وفي كل شيء علينا تطبيقها، يعني وكأن الفكر الإسلامي جاهز ليس على المسلمين إلا تطبيقها. هذه فكرة ساذجة. الفكر السياسي يجب أن يبنى، يجب أن ينتج، يجب أن يخرج من رحم الاجتهاد. أما الاجتهاد ميت، من أين يأتي الفكر السياسي الإسلامي؟ تطبيق الشريعة فكرة ساذجة. علينا أن نفهم الشريعة في ضوء الزمان والمكان. أولاً علينا أن نعطي للإنسان والقضايا الإنسانية وقضايا الزمان والمكان والحضارة وكل هذه القضايا هي متحولات الفكر البشري، علينا أن نعطيها حقها. ليس الشريعة جاهزة نأتي بها ونطبقها إلا إذا اعتبروا الشريعة هي مجرد قطع اليد وقطع الرأس. نعم، الذين يختصرون الشريعة في هذه الأشياء وفي ظاهر الشريعة ظاهر الدين معهم حق، لكن في الحقيقة أن الدين إلهي المنشأ وإنساني المقصد. الدين سماوي المنشأ وحياني المنشأ محمدي المنشأ وإنساني الغاية وإنساني المقصد. لولا نعرف هذا الإنسان وعقله وقضاياه وأرضه ووطنه وتربيته وسياسته واقتصاده بالعقل، لولا نعرف لا نستطيع أن نقوم بتطبيق القواعد الكلية على الزمان والمكان. نحن بحاجة إلى تفعيل الحركة الاجتهادية الإنسانية العقلانية بناء على القواعد الكلية، وهذا غائب مع الأسف في التجربة. طيب اسمحوا لي لأن الوقت ضيق أنتقل إلى السؤال الثاني باختصار شديد. أنا لا أظن أن إيران في عزلة. أنا لا أقبل هذه الفكرة. أستشهد بما يقوله أعداء إيران. الأعداء يقولون أينما نذهب نجد إيران، وهم يعني يحركون كل العالم، جيوشهم، سفنهم، على ماذا؟ أنا لا أعتقد أن إيران في عزلة. الواقع لا يقول بذلك. من يدخل في داخل إيران يكتشف أن فكرة العزلة فكرة غازية، غزو المصطلحات. إيران ليست في عزلة. الذي كان في عزلة هو ترامب. نعم، لديه قدرة، بإمكانه أن يفرض قدرتها على بعض الدول الخليجية، بإمكانه أن يفرض التطبيع، لكن التطبيع ليس جديدا. كان تحت الطاولة التطبيع موجود بكل معنى الكلمة، ولكن الآن ظهرت لفشل هذه الدول. وأعتقد أن الربيع العربي تم لأجل تمهيد التطبيع، لأن الربيع العربي لو لم يكن موجودا الآن الأمم العربية ما قبلت بهذه الفكرة، لكن كانوا شاطرين بارعين. هم أحدثوا تلك الأحداث لأجل أن يمنعوا إمكانية تحرك العرب في وجه التطبيع. لكن أريد أن أقول لكم أحبتي، باعتقادي هذا التقييم خاطئ. إيران ليست في عزلة. إيران بالفعل حاضرة، تستطيع أن ترسل ما تريد إلى أين تشاء. فقط لحظة، يعني ثواني. والقواعد الدولية في العلاقات الاستراتيجية لا تقول بالعزلة. هم يقولون أن لدى إيران وتركيا علاقات جدا استراتيجية كبيرة. كيف إيران في عزلة وهذه العلاقات الكبرى مع تركيا، العلاقات الاستراتيجية مع باكستان، مع كل الدول؟ لذلك أنا لا أوافق على فكرة العزلة حتى أعالجها. أعتذر إن أطلت عليكم، والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله.
Thank you so much. Okay, so next question for Dr. Morandi. You may not have heard me before, but I hope you can hear me now. It was about the Biden administration and what opportunities or challenges you see in terms of U.S.-Iran relations in the Biden administration. Dr. Morandi, do you hear me? Okay.
Yes, can you hear me?
Can everyone hear Hafsa?
Yes, I think.
Hafsa, are you on mute? Or is it just
no,
me?
I'm just on the off.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
It's just me. Okay, let me. All right.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Dr. Morandi, we can hear you.
Can you hear me? Can the audience hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we are. Yes, we are hearing you. Yes.
Yes, that's good.
Yes, please continue.
Are you able to hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. We can hear you.
Can you hear my? Okay.
For those who want to hear Dr. Morandi, go to the off channel.
Yes.
Right,
welcome.
So,
yes.
Okay. So very briefly, as I said, the Iranian foreign policy is both dynamic and certain. Yeah, it has a certain. It has a series of principles. Yes, the Iranian. Right. Iranian foreign policy is. I am.
Yes.
Should I continue?
Yes. Yes, please continue.
Shall I continue?
Yes, Professor Morandi. Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, he might be.
Shall I continue?
Miranda, can you hear us? Okay, please continue. Please
Can you hear me now?
Yes, please continue.
Yes.
Okay. I was going to say that Iran's policy toward Iran's policy towards the Biden administration will be based upon how Biden interacts with the nuclear deal. If Biden implements the nuclear deal in full, will respond in kind. In other words, if Biden implements what has already been negotiated, because the Iranians and the P5+1, which includes the Obama administration, in which Biden was the vice president, this deal was negotiated for years, and thus there's nothing more to negotiate. It's already, everything has been discussed, and every issue has been elaborated upon. So for Iran, there's no need and there is no room for negotiations with the United States until the United States implements what has already been negotiated. So if the Biden administration fulfills its obligations within the framework of the JCPOA in full, and this is something that even under Obama, the United States did not do. The United States under Obama never fulfilled its obligations within the framework of the JCPOA. And this time around, the Iranians are not going to be flexible. They will demand that the United States implements the deal in full before Iran, or at least simultaneously as Iran implements the deal in full. Last time around, what happened was that the Iranians implemented the deal, and then the United States implemented bits and pieces under Obama. So what the Iranians are saying is that there is no need for negotiations because everything with regards to the nuclear deal has already been negotiated. If the Americans want to show that they are sincere, that they want to have a different sort of relationship with Iran, the path is clear, and that is implementing what the Obama-Biden administration has already accepted. So I think it's going to become pretty clear the direction that US-Iranian relations take in the coming weeks. Iran-US relations will basically be based upon how Biden reacts to the JCPOA. He has two broad choices. Either he tries to use the Trump sanctions as leverage, which will have absolutely no fruit, but they will bear no fruit. Iran tolerated 4 years of Trump, and Iran did not appease the Trump regime. So Iran is not going to appease Biden. Or Biden moves towards the implementation of the JCPOA. If he does that, then the Iranians are willing to reciprocate. But I stress, once again, that this does not need negotiations. Negotiations between Iran and the United States can only begin after, well after, the JCPOA has borne its fruit and the United States has shown goodwill through the sincere and complete implementation of the nuclear deal. Thank you.
Thank you. For those who are on here, if we could go to the English channel now. Okay. Thank you so much to all of our speakers for your incredible presentations. And thank you to the audience for listening to this rich panel. This was just a start of conversations, case studies in different countries in the Muslim world: Turkey, Iran, Malaysia, and Pakistan. And tomorrow we'll have 2 more sessions that will also examine Sudan, Lebanon, Tunisia, and Morocco. So the first session will start tomorrow at 3 p.m. Istanbul time, and the second session will start tomorrow at 7 p.m. Istanbul time. So please make sure to also attend these discussions, and thank you again to everyone for your patience and for participating, and hopefully we'll get to continue these conversations in person someday, inshallah.